I also think their constant references to the US and China are very misleading. This notion that if we were, if we didn't have so many constraints on us imposed by regulators, that we'd be much better off. Because as I say, if you look at the US in particular, the operators there aren't doing brilliantly.
Yeah.
Apart from T-Mobile has been as the challenger in that market, but AT&T and Verizon haven't been perceived to be great companies to invest in.
Hello and welcome to another telecoms.com podcast, a rare one. What?
Telecoms.com, it sounded like you said then.
Telecoms.com podcast. Shall I take it from the top? Hello and welcome to another telecoms.com podcast. Is that all right now?
Yeah, just sounded like you said telecoms.
You better not fuck anything up because I'm going to be all over it.
It's on the record so we could check it.
Yeah, we can check it when it played back.
Maybe I imagined it.
Yeah, I think you did. Anyway, but thanks for watching my back.
Isn't that what the Australians call the Brits? The POMs.
Yeah.
So it is the telepoms.com.
Telepoms. Telepoms. With my fucking pom telecoms.
Is that supposed to be Aussie?
Yeah. Hey,
we prefer your
have I ever
voices.
claimed to be good at accents? I should do my my South African one for Greg, my South African one for Greg McCall.
No, for Australian you say g'day. G'day, mate. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. No, you've really got it nailed, haven't you?
Just
Jesus
the two
Christ.
words.
Don't give up a day job.
It's like the Scottish just going, okay, didn't you?
Exactly. No, my one.
Pure. It was pure.
My one that made me, when I was chatting to Greg McCall, the CTO of BT, the one that made me want to do his accent was when he said white wine. What wine?
Yeah, that's...
I actually really like South African accents.
So do I.
Cool.
I think it's nice. Yeah.
So anyway, what am I talking about? Yes, it's just two of us today. That's probably, as you can probably guess from the fact that we spoke an extra amount of shite to start it off. And it wasn't because someone bailed. It's just because we haven't got someone booked in. But we
don't always have to have someone on.
No, not at all. And it's going to mean that if for people who want to hang around till the end, I'll probably do a little bit more Scott Pacino self-indulgent, only peripherally relevant to telecoms type of thing at the end.
And I'm going to drink even more Hazy Janes than usual.
Yeah, well, actually, we got Hazy Janes and we got all the ones that Rafa brought last week. Thanks, Rafa. And I think we should. So we're on Hazy Janes now, and then after that we should have this this Lunar Haze, which is basically Beavertown's equivalent.
That's very
Hazy
nice.
Jane. And I think
good.
It's a
and I think we
percent-
should do a little
Lunar Haze is 1% lighter, actually.
0.5%. This is 5, and that's 4.5.
Oh, well, that's still something.
Rounding it up.
Yeah.
BT
So I
does,
think
because it's
we
one of those knockout stuff.
we owe it to our audience to do a compare and contrast
Yes.
sort of review. But in between talking about beer and general shite, we're going to talk about telecoms a little bit as well. I mean, it hasn't been a mad week for news, but we had one today, which is Vodafone just sort of announcing a bunch of sort of major corporate stuff. So I think we're going to lead by talking about Vodafone
They
Group
just sort of splurged it all out, didn't
Yeah,
they?
yeah.
One go.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
This is what we're doing.
on a Friday.
It's
It's
weird.
a bit like politicians when they announce bad news on a sort of Friday afternoon when no one can be asked to write it up.
Yeah.
But I don't think this is necessarily bad
It
news.
wasn't... No.
It's just
it
more
begs questions about the future of the organisation, I think.
Vodafone's one of the more busy ones when it comes to constantly fucking around with itself and selling stuff and reorganising and all that sort of thing. So we're going to lead with that. Then we're going to have Ian, you've been writing about Open RAN for a change, haven't you?
I have, yeah. So I haven't visited it for so long that I thought we should definitely do a couple of Open RAN pieces.
But you've got, I mean, you had a stormer of a Mobile Congress in so much as I remember chatting to you earlier there. You had so many really good interviews that you're still writing them up now, aren't you?
That's pretty much all I've done since I got back.
Yeah,
just do
yeah.
pieces from MWC. So
No,
yeah,
nice one.
I did a sort of deep dive on Samsung's strategy.
Right. Specifically as it pertains to Open RAN.
Yeah, so I met Alok Shah, he's called.
Okay.
Who, embarrassingly, I got his name wrong when I did the write-up and had to change it in the story.
Oh, no.
They got in touch and like, he's not called... I called him Sharma,
I
and he's
think
not called Alok
that,
Sharma.
that
he's
name
called
sprang
Alok
to
Shah.
mind for me. I think that might be
So
a
apologies
famous
to
person.
Alok.
Maybe it's a cricketer or something.
Yeah, well, I don't know anyway. For some reason, I totally got his name wrong. But he's...
Oh, no, he's an MP.
Alok Sharma.
Pretty fucking far from a
Alok
cricketer.
Shah.
The Right Honourable Sir Alok Sharma,
Right.
KCMG
That's what you're
MP.
thinking anyway, but-
KCMG MP. Is that like King's Counsel? I think it is. Yeah. So anyway,
apologies to Alok. He works for Samsung Electronics in America, and is obviously on their RAN side of things, and good guy, like very knowledgeable, and went over the stuff they're doing in detail and fielded a lot of questions and sort of took me around the stand. So that piece all came out of that meeting I had with them. But I did another story on more kind of thematic on where Open RAN's going, really, as regards smaller companies. And I think that ties in with some of the stuff that came out of the Samsung interview as well. So I can talk about both of those.
Excellent. And then as I threatened to a minute ago, I'm going to basically talk about, I think the unifying theme is the battle for control of the digital environment. So last week I touched on Apple fucking with the European Commission. Well, there have been a couple of developments on that one. And then there was also another big, not really strictly telecoms news, but big tech news, which was the US House of Representatives voting to effectively ban TikTok from the country. And I want to just get into that a little bit because there's all sorts of different angles to look at it.
This is just one step, right? It goes now to the Senate and they still have to...
Yeah, but it's... I mean, the Senate, I don't think is that much more useful than the House of Lords. I think 99% of the time they just wave shit through, which is what the House of Lords does. I mean, they'll make a bit of a noise and they might extract one or two little sort of horse trading concessions because their constituents have bribed them to get that concession in order to let it go through. All that pork barrel politics is especially flagrant in the States, where basically every bill has all sorts of irrelevant shit attached to it, so that every stakeholder, every person who you want to vote for it, you have to give them a little bribe that they can pass on to their donors or constituents. It's all just the organised corruption that we don't even bat an eyelid at, even more like lobbying. But anyway, so it's going to go to the Senate. They reckon. I think there might be some actual judicial reviews of it as well. But anyway, we'll get into that. So, and we've got a hard stop less than 2 hours from now, so we better just crack on with it. Ian, neither of us wrote up this Vodafone thing. Andrew just wrote it for us this morning. Did you edit it or give it a good read? Do you want to take the running with it?
I can take the running with it. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, it's multiple things, really, as we were saying.
Yeah.
The headline really is this sale that they've been talking about recently. It's been acknowledged by them that they were in discussions with Swisscom in Italy about a sale. Swisscom being active in Italy as well, obviously.
Yeah.
About a sale of their telco unit there, Vodafone Italy, and they've sort of sealed the deal.
Swisscom owns Fastweb.
That's right. Yeah. Which is interesting because Fastweb is not sort of known for its mobile stuff, is it?
No, I think it's fixed broadband.
It's fixed broadband, which I guess in a way makes this a more. You've still got this situation, haven't you, in the Italian market where it's been like an intensely competitive mobile market for years, ever since Iliad came in. What happened there, if you remember, was Wind and another Wind being Vimpelcom or Vion owned, I think at the time, and Three wanted to merge, and the Italian regulator said, well, you can, but as a condition of that merger, you have to sort of sell assets to
the usual European thing.
The usual thing to preserve a 4-player setup, and the consequence of that was Iliad, a French operator that's really aggressive and sort of undercuts people.
Iliad is Free in France.
It's
isn't
Free
it?
is the brand. Well, I think that's the brand they use in Italy as well.
Oh, okay.
I think so. They came in and took the market by storm and have grown very quickly. But as a consequence, other companies have had to cut prices and they've lost customers, and it's all been a bit of a nightmare. And it's still a 4-player market. So I guess this shouldn't change that, right? It's still kind of the same setup. But that was the headline really in the release they sent out today, was that they've sealed this 8 billion euro deal for Vodafone Italy. But there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's going on as well. So they've done this deal in Spain recently with Zegona.
Yep.
And they're in negotiations to sell, to merge with Three in the UK.
That's right.
Which is the one we know most about because it's local.
Yeah.
Which would leave them, I think, with 51%, and that would reduce the number of players to
Telepom.
3, unless there's Telepoms, yeah. That's the Telepoms one. And then there's been some staff changes as well. I think,
Yeah.
including on the UK side.
Yeah, so who's
I
their
can't remember
new
his
geezer?
name.
He's called Max Taylor.
I don't know who he is. Who's Max Taylor?
I don't know who he is either. Let's quote Kester Mann from CCS Insight, who was quick off the block and sent us some email
As he
comments.
always is.
Yeah, he says Max Taylor will take on one of the biggest roles. Yeah, we know that, Kester. Should we will head up? Okay. His appointment
You're
is
skipping
okay.
everything he wrote.
I know. I'm sorry, Kester. Don't take if you listen, Kester. Don't take it the wrong way. But his first paragraph was a little bit sort of generic. You know, Vodafone's quite big, so it's a big job. Yeah. But anyway, and then he gets to the meat of it a bit more in his second one. This appointment is recognition of Mr. Taylor's strong commercial and marketing expertise. If he's to eventually lead a combined Vodafone and Three, he will need to lean on all his experience bringing two brands together. Okay, it's still quite generic. I think he was.
I don't know what his background is, Max Taylor. To be honest, I mean, is he from within Vodafone or?
I believe so. I'm gonna look it up.
He's not an external appointment, but anyway, there's various other staff changes that have been going on as well, and the thing that unites it all, while you look it up, I would say, is Vodafone's been, I think, for a while perceived to be the underperforming operator of the big four or five in Europe, that being Deutsche Telekom, Orange, Telefonica, Vodafone. Telecom Italia used to be sort of grouped together with them, but I think they're sort of regarded as, they're a shadow of what they used to be kind of years ago. And then you've got BT, obviously, in the UK, but very much confined to the UK, not one of the companies with sort of extensive operations in other markets. And Vodafone's been the one that I think, if you look at its share price performance, it's done worse than any of the others over the last few years. Deutsche Telekom is the star of the group.
Yeah.
It's actually grown its share price, I think, which is quite unusual.
Oh, is this?
Do you know why that is?
Yeah, because of fucking TMUS.
Yeah.
But what's it like if we leave out T-Mobile US from DT's like overall share price? How's it doing?
Well, I don't know that you can do that, can you? Because they just factor it in. I mean,
no, I'm saying with us, if we do a back of fag packet intuitive calculation of how it's doing in Europe, its European operations.
Its operations are doing okay, but I think if you look over the years, it's had similar challenges to the others. It's not like it's. I mean, what you've seen happening in America with T-Mobile US is that company going off on an absolute tear. And adding, millions of customers, it seems, each year, and growing its revenue substantially. You look at its share price performance, T-Mobile, until recently, I think, where things have slowed down a bit, I think, or they've had it's more of an issue now at the profit level.
Right.
But I think until recently, it looked like an internet stock for a while.
Wow.
And it just goes to show there's nothing wrong with being a telco if you can grow. Like investors, they don't, they're not excited by whether you're an internet company or a telecom company. It's just that internet companies add customers and make money from somewhere new all the time, and telcos don't anymore.
Yeah, well, I think in our broader narrative over the last few pods, we've sort of, we've reconciled ourselves to the fact that operators are not double-digit growth companies, but they still make plenty of money.
T-Mobile recently.
Except T-Mobile, but they still make plenty of money.
Yeah.
And and that's fine.
Yeah.
And which leads to us, and we're probably going to get onto this more, which leads to us to have limited sympathy for them when they moan about how tough their lot is.
The funny thing about the boss of Deutsche Telekom, Timotheus Hertges, is that he's such a sort of pro-American in all of his commentary now, and his talks on stage and in discussions with the press. He's so pro the US and anti-Europe. That's his sort of overriding theme, that things are fabulous over in the States because they allowed his company and Sprint to merge a few years ago, and you buy Spectrum and you hold it for life, whereas here you have to sort of renew it every few years. And it's wonderful over there. It's like the promised land, and yet over here it's all horrible. But if you were to look at AT&T and Verizon in the US, they're not they've had similar challenges actually. I think there's a perception sometimes in Europe that we're so much worse, our operators are so much worse off than the US ones and the Chinese ones, and they're all doing dreadfully, and things are racing ahead on the 5G front in America. And I think it disguises what's really happening to some extent, because AT&T and Verizon have had all sorts of issues over the years.
Yeah, largely of their own.
Yeah, very bad bets on media. I mean, the really big one was the Time Warner one, obviously AT&T. But
special.
Verizon had its own moves with AOL and Yahoo. I mean, smaller amounts of money changing
let's
hands.
Let's buy 90s internet companies.
You know, they've both cut huge amounts of headcount in the last few years. They've not really grown sales, you know.
Well, it really interests me, like in the context of this sort of Vodafone rejig and us, you know, wondering what's going on there. I find the sort of strategic initiatives of large publicly traded companies fascinating.
Yeah.
Because it's amazing how often they are fucking bollocks.
Yeah.
You know, like the AT&T Time Warner one. I mean, I remember I was relatively early into my tenure in this, and I was saying this looks like a complete nightmare.
Yeah.
It looks like they overpaid. There's no synergies. How the fuck is a telco going to manage things like HBO?
Well, the whole
and Game of
rationale
Thrones
for it
and stuff like that
was flawed, I think, from the outset.
Yeah,
It was
some
Randall
advertising synergies or something like that.
That was a smaller thing. I mean, Randall Stevenson, when he was the CEO at the time, when he was being asked about it, he very much thought this idea of having a telco and a content player, an integrated telco and content player, was a good thing to have at a time when
like own the pipe and own the stuff that goes through the pipe.
But this was at a time when Netflix was already on the scene by then, you know, and people were able to go on their broadband connection and subscribe to Netflix and get TV, and things were very much moving in that direction. It was all becoming, the word that the telcos would like to use is disaggregated.
Yeah.
Why he thought it would be a good idea to have a content provider sort of united with a telco, which is something that was attempted back in the sort of early 3G days, really, as well.
Well, has it ever come off?
No, it hasn't come off. And why would it?
It didn't work. It didn't work on a smaller scale with BT and Sport. It's never worked.
Well, BT Sport, BT's whole TV opportunities dwindled as well, hasn't it?
That's what I'm saying. It didn't work. I'm listing other examples of where they've tried it and it hasn't worked.
I don't know. I mean, maybe if you look at some Asian markets that we don't cover as much, and I know that you talk to people like Vion, who my colleague Teresa met at Mobile World Congress. She met the CEO. And they're very big on their opportunity in terms of content, because they're saying that in their markets where, you know, it's like Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan and territories like that, where the big tech companies from the US don't play as much.
Yeah.
And there's and I get that. I totally go along with that.
And there's language advantages of being local.
Thing. If you make the right investments at the right time, then maybe you can move into that space, and that's your growth opportunity then. So I kind of get that to some extent, but. Yeah, I mean, here it's never going to work now. Obviously, trying to do that, given the position they have relative to the internet giants. So, I mean, coming back to Vodafone, before we sort of go completely off topic or on a tangent,
Heaven forbid,
they were very much seen as being the underperforming telco of Europe, I think.
Yeah,
and their share price had really been the opposite to the Deutsche Telekom one in terms of.
I think I've got about 20 quid of Vodafone. Let's see how it's looking since.
Yeah, you look that up, and therefore then there was Nick Reed, who'd been in charge for a long time. I think was under a lot of pressure, as having been perceived to not have done enough. I think on. The word they use is right sizing. It's almost like downsizing, isn't it? It's one of those horrible euphemisms, right sizing the company.
Yeah.
Which basically means selling a bunch of stuff, really, or finding merger and acquisition.
Right sizing always means downsizing. When they say right sizing, they never mean growing, do they?
No. And he was under pressure to. I think the problem that they have, if you look at some reports I've seen from Barclays, where they come out with these metrics at the moment to do with return on capital employed and. What your weighted average cost of capital is that Vodafone in a lot of the markets was always perceived to be the company that wasn't really covering its weighted average cost of capital. Yeah. And that's certainly the case. I mean, they're very outspoken on that in the UK. The whole thing about the merger with Three is that those two companies are perceived to be not covering their costs, and the reason for that is it's overly competitive. We've got too many networks. You wouldn't build out 4 train tracks in parallel.
Yeah.
This is something Vodafone's boss said on stage at Mobile World Congress. Margarita Della Valle, I think she's is how you pronounce it.
Yeah,
probably not
because it's not Spanish. It'd be Valle if it was Spanish.
Yeah, but she was
Italian.
on stage at this session where it was the big 4 CEOs basically for the first time talking about various issues and moaning about regulation as usual. But she very much gave that as an example. You wouldn't build out 4 train tracks for energy systems in parallel. So why do it with telco? That there's too much infrastructure and it makes it very hard to make a return when there's that kind of investment demand on a company and it might not get that many customers. And I get that. from their perspective, I think we can both agree with that to some extent. There's no reason why they shouldn't be better off in a 3-player market.
Can I just say something? So I looked up my I do some very superficial little retail trading on an app called Free Trade. I've stopped doing it. I did it mostly during the pandemic because the markets were quite volatile, and you remember all shares went down the toilet as soon as the pandemic came out, like in February, March 2020.
Yeah.
And I thought, even I, dilettante that I am, I thought that, there's obviously going to be an eventual market correction. So this seems like a good time to find a few £100 and chuck it around a bit. And I did all right on a few things like, buying really obviously distressed things like cruise liners or whatever, eventually going to pick up. And then I've mainly held on, and then I sort of profit took on those. And I've mainly held on to the ones that are either still down the toilet, like just stupidly catastrophic investments on stuff I knew nothing about, but I just thought I'd chuck a tenner in and see where it goes. And then a few telecoms ones like Nokia, Ericsson, Vodafone, just because it's my day job. But, it goes without saying, I hope, audience, that there's no conflict of interest, because for the sake of making my 20 quid into 22 quid, I'm not going to write a story that favours them. But anyway, looking at my Vodafone one and looking at the whole Free Trade tracks it back to 5 years ago. They got a 5-year thing. So it's basically their share price is half what it was 5 years ago. And it's been it's just been a steady sort of downward decline.
Right, and then if you think about what the overall market's done over that period of time, it probably looks even worse, isn't it? Yeah. I think this is what William Webb was saying when we had him on. So they've done really badly, and Nick Reed was under a huge amount of pressure while he was in the job, because he said we need to find M&A opportunities, we need to do some things in these markets where we're struggling, and nothing really came of it, and so they got rid of him, or rather he left.
Yeah,
because they never say they got rid of him, but I think pretty much he was under pressure to sort of move on. There was sort of shareholder pressure to have a change and a new face in, and that new face was Margarita, who was the CFO, and credit to her.
And he was the CFO before her. They like getting CFOs.
They do, yeah. I mean, the CFO is the number 2 person.
But I don't know what that says about the nature of the company, that they, let's use a slightly unflattering term, that they bring in a bean counter.
Yeah.
As opposed to, and incidentally, by the way, I looked up.
It depends what kind of CFO it is, though, because Timotheus Herges was the CFO. And he doesn't come across as a bean counter. He's quite a charismatic figure, I think.
Fair enough. No, and it is all about money at the end of the day. So that's not to say that you bring in a CFO and they're just a bean counter and all they care about is tiny little bits of margin here and there. But one other thing, by the way, before we forget, I looked up Max Taylor on LinkedIn.
Right.
So he, from March 2019, so for the past 5 years, he's been Chief Commercial Officer at Vodafone UK.
Okay. Yeah.
Prior to that, he was Managing Director Commercial and Marketing at EE.
Yep. Okay.
He did a bit of contracting from Vodafone a while ago. He was even at Orange back in the day. He's mainly his career progression is mainly marketing in telcos.
I wonder what the rules are on sort of gardening leave with all this stuff, because the one that really surprised me, which is the kind of scoop I got last week, was this guy at Ericsson's chips unit. He's like in charge of silicon engineering. He's going to Nokia.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, and it's like,
and you wrote it up like a football transfer or something.
Yeah,
is that your headline?
Yeah, it was something like that. But it's like someone from Man United going to Man City, because and that silicon stuff's really important to those companies.
It's like when Sol Campbell went from Spurs to Arsenal. I still never got over that.
Exactly. So that's exactly how people in the Nordic countries feel at the moment about all of this. Probably.
Right. Yeah.
But I just you wonder what the rules are, because with some companies it's quite stringent on you never joining a competitor, isn't it? But
yeah, well, and the Yanks try these stupid things like non-compete clauses, which I think is the most anti-free market.
Well,
I'm
not a fan of it, and I think I applaud the fact that he is able to go to Nokia if that's what he wants to do. But
it's a coup.
Yeah. Anyway, this guy Max obviously hasn't done that. He's just been at Vodafone. But I think the issue for her for Margarita when she came in and replaced Nick Reed, having been the CFO, stepping into the top job, she was immediately under pressure to actually show some progress with this right sizing, is the word that she's used quite a few times now. And credit to her, she's done a lot on that front. I mean, they've got the deal with Three that might have, I don't know, maybe discussions were probably underway under Nick Reed if they'd not said anything conclusive.
There
I'm
was certainly-
struggling to remember the timeline. But
I certainly think there were leaks, and you normally
Yeah.
assume now. Us experienced journalists know that very few leaks are actual leaks. They're all deliberate.
well, I mean, maybe to be fair to him, a lot of this stuff maybe was put in place just before he ended up leaving, and she's kind of stepped in at the right time where things are now starting to happen. But they have got a few things to show to investors all of a sudden, like Italy, like Spain, and hopefully from their perspective, like the UK, and the hopefully goes in the UK would presumably mean no stringent remedies as well. What they don't want to happen is having huge amounts of spectrum cut away from them, or having to sort of invite a new entrant into the market effectively. But
and they'll be hoping that the UK being free from European constraints, at least formally.
Yeah.
As a lever, I will mutter that we're not as free as we should be, but technically free of it, we could afford to be a bit more buccaneering and go, oh, go on then,
Yeah.
and not throw in all these punitive remedies.
Exactly. But where I'd be, and this brings us on to the bigger theme, sort of the bigger picture is. I think The Economist actually did quite a good piece on this as well. They don't normally write about Vodafone these days and BT and companies like that, but they saw reason to, because they did this sort of retrospective thing. You look at Vodafone back in the early 2000s, when it bought Mannesmann, didn't it, in Germany, and it was, I think for a while it
used to chuck money around like
well,
crazy.
This is back in the days when the European telcos were among the biggest companies in the world. They had ridiculous market caps, and they were, they were right at the peak, really. Back in the days when 3G licensing was going on, and they were expanding into. You had this whole D sort of regulation phase when they were going into other markets and snapping up mobile licenses, and people still didn't have mobile phones. So there was an opportunity to go and just grow from selling new subscriptions in a way that Netflix is picking up customers
and from
nowadays.
Nasty bits of bill shock when you dare to leave the country.
There's that, but they didn't even need that. You just get a few new subscribers every month, which you can't these days, and you're okay. And they were among the world's most valuable companies. And you compare it to where Vodafone is now. It was this sort of world straddling titan at one stage. It went into India, and it had operations everywhere. It owned a stake in Verizon, didn't it? It had a stake in Verizon Wireless at one stage. It really was a world-straddling company.
I think, when it sold its share back to Verizon,
they used that
it made
money.
a ton of money, didn't it?
It made a ton of money, but you think, well, where's that now?
Where's it gone?
Where's it gone? This is the thing. It's like it's quite frightening, really, that they pocketed all this money and it was perceived to be a great thing, and they could go off on. They had this thing called Project Spring, didn't they? Like a reinvention.
That's right. Well remembered.
Yeah, and it's just now their share price has done this over the years, and they're smaller than ever. What have they got left? They're in the UK, hopefully, with this merger with Three, where they own 51% of it. So they're not even, they're kind of, in a way, they're kind of diminished there. They have this operation in Germany, which I guess would be the really big one in Europe. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that I don't know.
That's not been doing very well, has it? I mean, it might have turned the corner recently, but for a long time, it's been perceived to be very problematic. I think some of the deals that were done there haven't sort of worked out the way the Kabel Deutschland it was years ago, and there was a takeover of Liberty Global assets as well, I remember a few years ago, and these things haven't paid off in the way they were hoping. Deutsche Telekom, which we were talking about earlier, having done really well in the US with T-Mobile US, has also been very successful in the German market, I think, in the last couple of years, and that's made things a lot harder there for local rivals like Vodafone, and Telefonica is the other one. So I think they've actually struggled in the German market. They've lost the other two big Western European markets are Spain and Italy, which they're no longer in. So they have this smattering of operations in Eastern Europe, places like Romania, and I guess they have a presence in Czech Republic. Am I getting that wrong? But they have some operations in other parts of Eastern Europe. Obviously, in Romania will probably be the big
announcement.
one.
No, their announcement.
And then they have the Vodacom business in Africa.
Yeah.
Which is, maybe still more of a growth story. I mean, it's something I always neglect to look at that much when we cover financials, because it sort of gets left to our Connecting Africa guys to do that. But I know if it's doing anything like Orange's business, and that's really where they're kind of still able to grow revenues, and they have a presence there in things like mobile money and some of these opportunities that just don't exist in Western Europe, and that's all well and good. But they're they're just not in a good situation. And
No.
I think the optimism that Margherita will try and take out of this deal with Swisscom is, well, yeah, okay, it's a good short-term thing for shareholders because they're out of a problematic market and maybe they've got a fee that they're happy
But
with.
everywhere's a fucking problematic market, isn't it?
But then in 2 years' time, if things aren't going well in the UK and Germany, are we looking at where does it go next? What else do they sell? What do they sell next? They can't keep just downsizing all the time.
And that seems to be their only business strategy.
Yeah,
and
just get rid of stuff.
Not downsizing.
Right size.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to do a couple of spot tests for you on Vodafone. You were trying to work out what countries they operate in Europe.
I think they're in the Czech Republic,
Yep, one.
Yeah.
You got to list them all.
Romania.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure they're not in Slovakia.
I don't think they are, no.
No, I think it's Telefonica, Deutsche Telekom, and Orange there.
Right. Come on, you've got two. You've got.
Are they in Austria?
You've got 9 more to go.
Oh crap! Well, I wouldn't know.
Yeah, I want you to do your best, just for the hell of
Croatia,
it. Croatia, no. So
Serbia. They're probably not in any of those.
Do you want me to list them? Shall I stop
Poland,
dicking you about? No. Right, you obviously haven't got a clue. That's fine. I wouldn't have had a clue either.
Hungary. They're in Hungary.
They. Where's that? No, they're not. Let me list them: Albania, Czech Republic, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Netherlands, Portugal, Romania, Spain, United Kingdom.
Okay. But some of these are very, very small markets.
Well, and it's interesting. In their rejig,
and
they've said this is from their bulletin they sent out this morning. That they called it Vodafone Investor Update, but it's basically a press release.
Yeah.
It says, from 1st of April 24, we will also be changing our organisation to better execute on our strategic priorities.
Yeah.
We'll be organising ourselves in 5 business divisions: Germany, European markets. So there's Germany by itself, and then there's all the other 10 European markets.
Which shows how small and insignificant they are. Do you know the other odd thing about this, by the way, which we talk about a lot, is this European single market concept of having...
For people listening, he did air quotes.
Yeah, because the single market's already there. But what they really mean, I think, when they talk about that is this idea of having several big operators that span the whole region. Yeah, and that somehow you can engineer a situation where...
It's basically the same 4 people in every market.
And they do have operations in a lot of these countries. But the more that Vodafone does this kind of thing, the less likely that's going to happen anyway. At one time, they were a company with operations over all of Europe. And
is there any country that has all 4 in it?
Well, all 4 of those operators.
Is there any country that has DT, Vodafone, Orange and Telefonica in it?
I don't think so. I don't know.
Not Germany. Germany hasn't got Orange, has it?
Well, Germany's only got 3 anyway.
It's only got 3 anyway.
Unless you count 1 and 1, which I'm not because it's too insignificant. But
UK...
I don't think there is. But the other problem is... the problem is if they're on the retreat from some of the big markets like Spain and Italy, then that vision of having them playing a kind of pan-European role is receding anyway. Also, we don't want all 4. We want 3, really, don't we? That's what they're saying, because they like the idea of having 3 rather than 4. So, but I think it makes this whole notion of a single market in the way they talk about it harder to realise.
It's incoherent.
It's more fragmented than ever. You've got Swisscom owning their business in Italy. You've got Zagona owning it in Spain. You've got this MásMóvil and Orange. I mean, the whole thing's become...
So if anything, it's going in the opposite direction.
It's almost going in the opposite direction. I personally think the single market thing's a bit. I don't get it anyway. I think what they really want is 3 operators per country. I mean, I get that there's some scale effects from having one operation, say Madrid, that serves all sorts of countries across the region. But as I say, deals like this are just moving them further away from that.
The European Union is, at its core, a corporatist endeavour. And by corporatist, I'm not sure if I'm using the definition of it strictly correctly, but corporatist basically means a preference for large corporations. And a corporation, not in American sense, a corporation in the literal sense just means a body, yeah?
Yeah.
So large organisations. And that's what the EU wants. The EU would ideally like to be able to deal with a few major players, and they could all go out and have long lunches together and basically all sort out Europe among themselves.
Yeah.
Whereas right now it's a pain in the arse because it's too fragmented.
And it's even more so after these deals.
Yeah, exactly. So you were sort of asking a rhetorical question about why the EU wants that sort of thing. I'd say one potential answer to that question is that it's inherently corporatist and it would like consolidation, but then it's got this tension within it, as we often characterise as a tension between Thierry Breton and Margarita Vestager, where she's all pro-consumer, i.e. she wants as much competition as possible, which is inherently driving towards a more fragmented direction because that's more competition.
Yeah.
Whereas Breton's the more pure corporatist who's like, no, I'd just like to deal with a few companies, preferably French ones.
Yep.
And then I only need to speak to a few people and I can spend the rest of the time doing my hair.
Yeah, totally.
Is what he reckons.
But I think the other problem for them at the moment, just to sort of tie in this theme of them shrinking and becoming less significant, is that as well as all this stuff going on with asset disposals, basically, you know, not just including selling operating units, but actually divesting things like towers. You know, they've done that, haven't they, in Vodafone already? There's carve out of the towers unit. Vantage. Yeah. Okay, they still have, I think, a majority stake in that. Do they have a majority stake in it? They've not sold a majority stake in Vantage, I don't think.
I'll look that up.
But
you should be doing all this. You should be Jamie.
They don't own all of it, clearly. So that's a carve out where they've brought in other shareholders to basically raise capital.
Vantage is majority owned by North Hill Capital.
Is it really? But what is North Hill Capital?
Private equity, I would assume.
I thought they still had the majority stake in Vantage. Anyway, the point is that they've disposed, and this is not just them, other operators have gone down this route of hiving off like infrastructure, whether it's fixed line infrastructure, as has happened in Italy with Telecom Italia, or towers. You know, they're less in control of the stuff they use to build networks. And you can think about that any way you want. You can think that's a good thing because it allows you to focus on doing services well. And not have to worry about that as much.
By the way, I got that wrong. That was a different Vantage.
Right. Vantage Towers. I think they still own the majority stake in it by quite a long way, 83% or something.
Yeah.
Is that what it is?
I can't see the percentage, but I can see from what's come up on Google that it's still... Oh, no, 89.26. There it is.
I'm out.
And then Elliot's got 5.
Points.
So yeah, that other one was bollocks. Ignore that. That was a different Vantage. But it was called Vantage Infrastructure. You can see why I got confused.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, you were saying.
So they've sold infrastructure basically, or they've not sold all of it, but they've sold a stake in their infrastructure. They've sold operating units entirely, and then the other thing that's going on is this relationship they have with big tech, which they moan about a lot, but then they do big deals with Microsoft that are worth 1.5 billion and say they're going to own part of our IoT business and they're going to do generative AI for us and we're going to move all of our IT.
A little preview, everyone. We're hoping to have someone from Microsoft on next week.
Yeah, well, it'll be good to talk to him about this sort of thing, obviously. But we're going to move all of our IT applications into Azure data centers, and we're going to rely on them really heavily. And
basically, our whole business is going to be run by a fucking generative AI.
We're not putting our telco cloud in there and stuff like that, but everything else, and we'll take their generative AI stuff. We don't want to do that ourselves because why would we? They've made the investments, and we can't really do it. And it's just like it's all a bit depressing, really. There's no it's all sell, rely on big tech.
Do you want depressing? I've got another little spot quiz for you.
Yeah, go on. It's like being on with
Elena.
With Elena at Christmas, yeah.
This is a good one. We can do it in whichever order you want. Let's go in this order. What do you think Vodafone sold its 45% stake in Verizon for, back to Verizon, back in September 2013? Have a guess at how much what the value of that stake was when it sold it.
20 billion?
$130 billion.
130 billion?
$130 billion. Now, part 2 of the quiz.
What do they do with it?
Well, quite. and this leads to part 2 of the quiz.
Just it with steroids.
What is Vodafone Group's market cap today?
It's probably about 20 billion.
24. So they trousered $130 billion 10 years ago, and now the whole company is worth 24 billion.
Where's the money gone?
Well, quite. It's fucking remarkable. What's the max that Google Finance will give me? Google Finance will give me all the way back to about 95.
They were at the peak in 2000, probably. They're about the early years of the 2000s.
So here we are, 2013.
5 or 6, maybe.
Yeah, so 2013, when it flogged this Verizon stake, the share price was 288 pence,
Right.
and it's now 70 pence. So that's where it fucking went. Although I don't think that even. I think even at 288 pence, its market cap is not as much as it sold the Verizon thing for. So I must be missing a detail.
This windfall they got from Verizon, I know they had this Project Spring where they spent money on sort of improvements, if you want to call it that, and maybe some M&A, maybe some stuff to do with India. But did they return?
That's a good point. You wonder where the money's gone. A lot of it's Vodafone Idea, isn't it?
But did they spend a lot of it on like returns to shareholders and that sort of thing? You know, I don't know, but. Did shareholders pocket some of that as well?
So here's Reuters in September 2013 headline: Vodafone's Project Spring to pressure competitors.
Right.
Vodafone plan to boost investment in broadband and superfast mobile. I hate that superfast. That winds me up.
Yeah.
Mobile networks after its $130 billion deal with Verizon could forces plans to raise capital expenditures by £6 billion over 3 financial years to improve network quality. So it spent a lot of it on network.
That's not that much though, is it? $6 billion over 3 years out of a pot.
Oh, here we are.
Big.
Here we are. With that in mind, Vodafone decided to plough some of the proceeds of the sale of Verizon Wireless into infrastructure, but the bulk of the windfall, $84 billion of it, will be handed to shareholders,
there you are,
with the rest to pay down debt. But then I don't get why its share price didn't go up more. I mean, isn't that why you give money to shareholders?
I also don't get why the debts are still so high.
Yeah.
I don't know what their debts... I mean, we'd have to look at what their debts were in 2013, but they're still pretty heavily indebted, I think. If you look at the net debt to EBITDA ratio is how companies normally look at these things. I mean, it's not abnormal by comparison with European peers, but I suspect it's still between 2 and 3, that ratio, which is, for a company that's not growing sales and is under pressure on profits, it's not ideal. Also at a time of rising interest rates and inflation and such like.
I just Googled Vodafone debt and I've got a link to missed payments. So,
well, I don't, yeah.
I mean
there's
basically...
no red flags being raised,
yeah.
But I just find the story, you know, they'll view this thing that they've done today with Swisscom in a positive light, and
their long-term debt is twice their market cap.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, I keep butting in, but just all their financials. Maybe that's not that big. Maybe that's normal, that amount of leverage as Americans will.
So the long-term debt's what,
53.
53. The net debt will be lower than that, but
I guess so. And apparently that was a 22% decline on this Google.
Yeah,
entry.
And obviously any kind of debt at all.
Oh yeah,
substantial.
Hold on a sec. May 23, there's something from their preliminary results. Net debt decreased by 8.2 billion euros to 33 billion euros, so it's lower than that.
The 33 billion euros is still quite a lot of net debt.
Well, still more than their market cap.
I don't know what the ratio of EBITDA is to net debt for them, but I suspect it's somewhere between 2 and 3. That's usually what's going on in Europe. But that's people aren't panicking when it's at that level in the telco sector because it's been like that for a long time. But you've got to remember these companies aren't growing revenues and they're under pressure on profits. And they've got things like rising staff costs and rising energy costs to contend with, and interest rates.
I think it's over 3.
So it's over 3, yeah. So it's not... I mean, they'll probably use some of these... so I'm guessing that this 8 billion from Swisscom, I don't know what they're saying in their statement they're going to do with the money, but I suspect some of that will go towards paying off net debt. That's usually what they do with.
Where's all this debt come from?
Well, this debt's been accumulated over years from earlier M&A activity. But what I don't understand is when there's a $130 billion windfall from a Verizon sale, you know, you kind of wonder why it's as substantial as it is. If that was only 10 years ago, I don't know. I'd have to look into it in more detail, the history of it. But
Mannesmann was a massive one. I know that predates all of this.
Yeah,
but there was some. They've done some big spending over the years.
Yeah, I just think their story is very much a kind of European telco. The state of European telecom, in a way, I think, is what you take out of what's going on at Vodafone at the moment, because it's, you know, they're the worst share price performer out of those big 4, but it's not as though the other ones are doing brilliantly. If you take T-Mobile US out of the picture, at Deutsche Telekom, you know, and then you include other companies there like Telecom Italia, which has obviously had a bit of a nightmare, I think, over the last few years.
Yeah,
They
and
had all
the
sorts
Italian state keeps poking its nose into everything.
They do, and they've got shareholder issues. They've got disputes that have gone on between Vivendi and Elliott
God, that
Capital
Vivendi
for
thing's been going on
years.
forever,
They've
hasn't
had
it?
several changes of CEO.
That was fascinating. Actually, I remember writing about that Vivendi thing. The thing I found really interesting about it is I think Vivendi bought something like...
They had about a quarter of it. And
Exactly, and there's a certain threshold where if you've got a shareholding above a certain amount, then you've got to basically make an acquisition bid, or you got to make some kind of formal. And so they kept themselves just below that threshold.
Yeah.
But then they seem to be running the company anyway with an ownership of about 20% of the fucking thing, which always struck me as a bit dodgy. And then this really aggressive private equity firm, Elliott, which has got 5% advantage, steamed in and went, nah, we're having none of that. And Elliott seems to be calling a lot of the shots, and they own even less of it than Vivendi
Well, I mean,
does.
the shareholders call the shots. It's just it's just never as public sometimes as it is.
But what I'm saying is one very vigorous minority shareholder can call all the shots. When you bear in mind that most shareholders are institutional, like pension funds.
Yeah, but because they had such a big stake, I guess.
Yeah.
Because it is just below that threshold that they had enough clout to sort of throw their weight around.
Yeah. It's a flaw in the shareholder model where you can have over-representation of one minority shareholder.
You get these activists wading in who throw their toys
well,
out the pram every now and
Elliott's
again.
like that.
They're known for that. I mean, you wonder with the other thing that's going on at Vodafone is the involvement, isn't it, of Etisalat now? Etisalat has a stake.
They've got a double-figure stake, haven't they?
Yeah,
and they're a seat on the board.
Now that's very interesting to see where all of that could go, because they obviously have their own telco interests in the United Arab Emirates, and we're at a point where I think we talked about this last week to some extent with Aramco and everything, but we're at a point where these Middle Eastern companies, they've got this coming out of a situation where energy prices have been very high, and they've done rather well for themselves on the back of that.
Yeah, and they've got stupid amounts of sovereign
Got
wealth.
stupid amounts of sovereign wealth. But they're also concerned about the future and not being dependent on energy in the long term.
Yeah.
And pushing into other sectors.
Diversifying.
I mean, this is what they're trying to...
into golf and football and shit.
Totally. It's all about soft power, isn't it, I think? But I think this is partly to do with that. It's partly soft power, I think, having sort of interests in these corporations that are active in Western Europe, and there's an element of that in there, and there's an element of diversification as well, I think.
Sometimes I actually think it's a little bit xenophobic when they do things like they're at the source of a big schism within the organisation of global golf because of this live thing.
Yeah.
And then they get people like Cristiano Ronaldo to go over there and play for a team. And people talk about things like sports washing because people are very quick to, and with some justification, to talk about Saudi Arabia's human rights and things like killing Jamal Khashoggi and that kind of shit.
Yeah.
There's two issues I have with that. I think people can be very selective, and this isn't in any way exonerating Saudi Arabia. It sounds like from its human rights record is pretty shit. But there are plenty of other countries that have got pretty shit human rights records that we choose to gloss over.
Yeah.
And the second one is like sports washing. I understand what they're saying. They're basically saying, what is the international reputation of Saudi Arabia? They're kind of a bit kooky. They're oil. They're very. It's obviously the country that's the center of the Islamic religion, and so that whole region, we wonder whether whether all their decision making is primarily made on a sort of theological basis, like it is in Iran.
Yeah.
And so there's lots of cultural stuff to overcome. And so when people accuse them of sports washing, I think maybe all they're trying to do is to go, yeah, okay, so we've got lots of cultural differences, and we all wear head scarves or whatever you call their head covering, but we're just like you, and we're just as interested in sport, and we're just interested in making money, we're just interested in technology and all that sort of thing. And I sort of think, putting myself in their position, well, of course they want to integrate themselves into the rest of the world. Yeah. So to dismiss that as sports washing just because they choose to spend some of their money on paying golfers obscene amounts of money to hit a ball around in Saudi Arabia rather than in the US, I think it's a bit disingenuous. But
I mean, there's lots. It's very complicated. It's morally complicated, isn't it? Looking at it and everything. But I go along with you. I mean, the latest one's tennis, because they've got the WTA. They're trying to pull to Saudi Arabia to do some events there. So I think it's in the news today. Now that you mention it, not Serena Williams because she's not playing anymore, but Venus Williams is still playing.
I know,
remarkably
bless her.
at 43, but she said she won't compete there
because
on,
of their
on moral grounds,
misogyny or
because
perceived
of the,
misogyny.
Yeah, because of the human rights record. I don't know if it was necessarily completely to do with the treatment.
But is it one of those countries where they've got like really old school attitude to women? By old school, I mean like 1,000-year-old attitude.
Well, it's better than it was, I think. So I think
women didn't used to be able to drive and stuff. Is that right?
The Crown Prince, whose name I can't remember, but the guy who's obviously linked with the whole Khashoggi.
MBS, Mohammed bin Salman.
That's it.
MBS to his mate.
He's regarded like there's various ways of looking at him. One is to look at him as a sort of murderous tyrant who
and we should stress it's never been proven that he did it, but everyone reckons he did it.
Yeah. And it is still. It's still an authoritarian state. You know, it's not like you get to vote who's in control. But if you're going to try and look at him in a more positive light, apparently he's done quite a lot for trying to move things in the right direction on women's rights.
A bit.
Like, say you're talking about women driving or being able to do other things is better now than it was if you go back 20 years.
Yeah.
And so I think one way of looking at this, we're well off on a tangent here.
Yeah, it's fine.
But one
That's
way
what we get to do when it's just you and me.
One way of looking at this sports stuff is to say, well, maybe we should embrace it and go in there, and that will help to bring about change even faster than it already is. And another way is to do the sort of Venus Williams. Well, I don't want to be involved in it because it's almost like you're endorsing it. And how you look at that, I had a chat with someone earlier on the phone about. Well, it wasn't an off the record thing, so I can mention him. It's John Strand. We always mention on the pod, but we were chatting about China.
And we know that he's generally hawkish on China.
And I can't remember the thing we were initially talking about, but we were talking very briefly about China and the whole thing about globalization. And he was saying if you go back 20 years, 30 years, this whole issue about Huawei and Chinese companies being involved in our economies wasn't there because we weren't as globalized then. And the whole thing was that if you bring them into the world, if you bring them into the World Trade Organization, if you involve them in global trade affairs, then maybe you can bring about kind of democratic change in those. Because this is all in the wake, obviously, of Tiananmen Square and things like that.
Can I say something about that narrative, which I think a lot of people miss? People think that we were naive and duped by, firstly, I think it's incredibly presumptuous to talk about us allowing them into like the World Trade Organization. Like, who the fuck are we to allow the most populous? And,
well, it was a club they weren't in, I suppose.
Yeah, well, quite. But that's a bit conceited by itself.
It's a bit like the UN, it's a club of a few countries, isn't it?
And then the other thing was, the narrative is it's conditional on them becoming more like us, i.e. more of a, quote, democracy.
Yeah.
And I put it in quotes because while we are a democracy, everyone knows that the democratic system, at the end of this year, the Yanks are going to choose between two octogenarians, one of whom is losing his marbles, the other of whom arguably never had any fucking marbles in the first place.
The Economist.
Yes, well, quite. So that's the only reason I put, I say, quote, democracy. But anyway, we still do have more of democracy in China. That goes without saying, or Saudi Arabia for that matter.
Yeah.
But, it's them being part of the global trade system is not conditional on them becoming more like us. Yeah, there are certain rules we attach to it, which I think they have violated. I mean, some of the biggest knocks on China that I won't push back on, the kind of stuff that John might talk about.
But it seems like it was conditional, doesn't it, now?
Well, exactly, and this is the narrative I'm pushing back on. The stuff I do agree with, like they're things like currency manipulation or intellectual property theft or protectionism. That's all breaking the rules of the WTO and should be denounced and dealt with accordingly. But expecting them to turn into, China's one of the most ancient countries in the world. They're not just going to suddenly turn into, the 52nd state of the US.
Yeah.
And, if the Chinese people, for whatever reason, are willing to put up with an autocracy, such as Xi Jinping seems to have managed to entrench, then it's none of our fucking business. I mean, we'd rather not have that. I wouldn't want to live under that. I wouldn't like the relative lack of journalistic freedom.
I'm not sure they're willing to put up with it. It's just,
but we don't know.
It's just
the question is, it's not our business.
We don't know, but it's just a reality. But
it just is what it is.
I think the feeling is that the trade argument is that if you involve these companies in global trade and they become more exposed to the rest of the world and they see what things are like, the natural instinct of a person is to want to have some kind of control over their own life and to have some kind of say in the way that a state is run. That's just the natural inclination, I suppose. If you look at the history of revolutions and where people tend to go and what they tend to want politically, as imperfect as democracy is, that's generally what people sort of want. So
One last thing I'd say about the China being,
but it hasn't worked.
being
obviously.
embraced. Well, but I think it has worked in so much as.
Well, it hasn't worked
I mean,
in terms of them being part of the trade system, bringing
yeah,
about democracy in China.
they've done some piss taking, and that's an ongoing issue. But I think it has worked on two levels. Firstly, it's massively increased. By the way, before you finish that that Beavertown Hazy one, how does that compare to Hazy Jane?
I thought it was really nice.
I think I still prefer Hazy Jane a bit.
Yeah, it's still good,
decent.
though.
It's more fizzy than Hazy Jane.
And if it's a little bit weaker, then that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Not necessarily a
if
bad
you're having
thing.
a few of them. So.
However, on price, Hazy Jane wins by a lot.
Yeah.
Are they expensive?
Beavertown's more expensive than Brewdog in general.
They're £1 more, but per pack of 4.
And this one's even less.
Neck oil is...
In
Well, we
terms
know
of
neck oil's expensive because when we get to the pub after, we're going to be dropping £7 on a fucking pint, aren't we?
Well, that's
Just to
the pub,
finish
isn't
off that China thing, and I might have to wrap this whole thing up as well.
it? Especially as we're not talking about Vodafone
It's been a good old tangent. No, I mean... You know, I know it's a cliche, like my colleague and boss Evan always jokes about the tangents on the pod, and of course we're going to go off on much more tangents when we haven't got a guest because we've got no one's feelings to respect.
Yeah.
But I think it's still been a positive for two reasons. Firstly, let's not forget that it's made the Chinese richer, which is good for them. Before we view it in totally parochial, self-interested terms. And secondly, they are, whether we like it or not, they are now plugged into the global economic system, which is what allows things like the Yanks to put pressure on them by cutting them, by trying to starve them with top-end chips and all that sort of thing. You know, whether we like it or not, if China, like people are always catastrophizing about China invading Taiwan, and maybe it will happen, but if it did, the knock-on effects. You know, China's much more exposed, for example, to the global economic system than I think Russia ever has been.
Yeah.
So if they were just a bad casus belli and they were belligerents and they just invaded Taiwan and the whole US sphere of influence and perhaps quite a lot of neutrals as well just went fuck China and stopped doing business with them, even though it would massively damage us as well, then it would really damage them. So my point is that by China being integrated into the world economic system, it naturally means it has to be a lot more cautious about acting unilaterally because the knock-on effects are so much more profound. But anyway, yeah, quickly bring it back to Vodafone and operators before we move on. I agree with what you're saying. If all you ever hear about from Vodafone is, oh, look, we've managed to flog another thing and pay off a bit more debt, that's not a very inspiring ongoing narrative, is it?
No.
And and looking at Vodafone's share price, so it actually ticked up about a couple of percent on the news this morning, but it's still below where it was earlier on this week.
I mean, that's the bump their announcement today's had is 2%.
Something like that. But it was down 3% on the week. So it's not even at its start of week high.
Yeah.
So I don't know why it had gone down. Presumably people who know about these things had started speculating about what their Big Friday announcement was going to be. I didn't know. I had no prior awareness. But and so there was some kind of pessimistic selling of its stock, and then there was a slight recovery, but not even.
So this is the problem I have with the Margarita narrative is about this to do with this right sizing is that. Where does it lead? What does it leave Vodafone with? It leaves it with operations in markets where it's still finding it quite difficult to grow sales, clearly, because all telcos are, and yet you just have less. You just have less interests, less sales, less profits. You're even smaller, but you're not growing you're not doing especially when the markets you're left in. It's not as though they're a company, let's say, theoretically, there's a company that has this super duper, growing 10%, 20% every quarter, year on year, and it's weighed down by this crappy unit that is incredibly problematic, and they manage to do a deal where they offload that unit and someone picks it up, and all of a sudden they're like, they've got rocket boosters on. That's not the situation, is it? They've just sold one bit that was slightly worse than other bits that remain that are still bad, but not quite as bad. That's essentially what they've done.
Yeah, it feels like managed decline.
It's managed decline, totally. That's the word for it. It's managed decline.
And I'll tell you another little...
I mean, that's the headline, really.
Managed decline, yeah. So their share price about 70p today, yeah?
Yeah.
When do you think the last time it was 70p was? Just fucking doesn't matter, just have a guess.
Is it in the 90s?
Yeah.
Right.
It was before the dot-com bubble.
Yeah.
So it was 70p in December 96.
Which is probably when they were like a tiny little company, and that was probably really good in
Well, they
terms
were
of
like Raycall or something.
Exactly. They were probably at the time, 70p was like, oh my God, look at all the speculation about what this company could be. So
I've just looked on Google Finance, it gives you a few little choice media coverage for historical stuff.
yeah.
May 13th, 2019, what comes up on Google Finance? Telecoms.com. Vodafone share price tumbles after dividend cut report.
There you are.
It's a weird headline. I bet I wrote that. Shall we see if I wrote it? No, it's Jamie.
Blame it on Jamie.
Yeah, Jamie, who ironically is at Vodafone now. So one last thing I want to say, looking at their share price, guess what their dot-com bubble peak was? So we know in 96 they were about 70p, which is what they are now.
400p.
Close, 450.
Yeah.
Damn.
I love how you in the UK the price of the share is in
Pence.
pence. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, and they are to some degree symptomatic, perhaps one of the worst examples of this decline of European telcos. And we have lots of chats about the regulatory remedies that could be made. And we, as we spoke about at Mobile World Congress, they were doing lots of the usual moaning. And I think one thing I will say is some of their moaning is justified. I think there probably is an excessive amount of red tape in Europe, surprisingly enough.
Yeah.
And Europe has a reputation for being less business friendly, less entrepreneur friendly than the States. But on the whole, I just see all these telcos, whether they're European or American ones, there's just so many self-owns that they've done. And I think one of the reasons is because they're in denial about what they are. They're always trying to diversify and M&A their way into a more sexy track, whereas they're just a fucking utility, and that's fine. Just bump along.
I also think their constant references to the US and China are very misleading. This notion that if we were, if we didn't have so many constraints on us imposed by regulators, that we'd be much better off. Because as I say, if you look at the US in particular, the operators there aren't doing brilliantly.
Yeah.
Apart from T-Mobile has been as the challenger in that market, but AT&T and Verizon haven't been perceived to be great companies to invest in over the years. Well, look at the share price performance of AT&T over the last 5 years. I bet it's not great.
Shall I?
Yeah.
AT&T. Okay.
Or Verizon. I bet over a 5-year period, those guys don't look like stocks that you should have been investing in. Yet the perception that the European telcos want to give is that they're
AT&T's down 26% over a 5-year period.
There you are. Right, so it's not as disastrous as what's happened with Vodafone.
Let's see, Verizon. Verizon over 5 years is down 32%.
Right. I mean that's pretty terrible if you look at the share, the stock market as a whole.
BT is kind of half.
So this idea that if they were unshackled by regulators, they'd be as well off as the American firms. What do you mean? As well off as AT&T and Verizon? You'd only be down 30% instead of 75% or whatever. I mean,
he's soaring, Ian.
It's all telcos all the world over have unfortunately got the same problem that companies mature, and when they're in that kind of space, they become what's known as utilities.
Yeah.
And that's what they are. They don't want to be seen. Now, I don't like the application of the term to telcos that much, because I still appreciate the fact that your water company...
It's not quite as commoditized as
your water company
or
has not
electricity.
made massive advances in radio technology over the last few years, or water pipe technology even. It's the same stuff we've had since the Victorian age, whereas the innovation that goes on in telecoms I can appreciate.
Yeah.
And that's the unfairness, I think, about comparing them to those companies.
And would I rather be editor of telecoms.com or water.com?
Well, exactly. We get to do... It is...
Is it flowing? Yes. Okay.
I am impressed by what these guys
do.
It's pretty bloody amazing what these, we're critical of things like 5G and, they haven't monetized it, that you had that headline this week that Andrew wrote and everything. And granted, that's the case, but the stuff that goes into that technology, the technological breakthroughs, what they can do. If you were, I mean, I said this to my brother-in-law because he was like very much sort of, he's in the event side of things, and he was doing something to do with telcos, and phoned me up for some sort of advice on it. And he was sort of lumping them in with water companies and energy companies as utilities. And I said to him, well, you think back 25 years, and if someone had said to you, you can walk around on the street with a device that allows you to find out what time your train's going to go, or where you need to be, or someone will even write an essay for you these days if you just ask it to. People would have been like,
you look at the difference between difference between like a Michael Douglas Wall Street brick, and now, which is separated by 40 or 50 years.
Right, but even that Michael Douglas Wall Street brick actually at the time was like, if you go back a few years before that, people wouldn't even have imagined mobile phones as being something that was there. And that's a relatively short amount of time. It's within our lifetime.
Well, people used to call radios the wireless, because that was the most remarkable thing about it.
Yeah.
So okay, we better move it on. But it's interesting for Vodafone. If I hope the 3 thing does go through to them, because but I still can't be that optimistic that they'll necessarily turn their fortunes around.
I can't be that optimistic that it's going to turn their fortunes around. I mean, I think it's marginal improvements, isn't it? Maybe they're making a return where they weren't before, but they're not going to be. It's not like they're going to turn into Nvidia.
No. Okay.
Can you imagine?
So another. We talk about Open RAN a fair bit. I'm just going to frame it quickly before we get onto you talking about your interview that you did at Mobile Congress. Open RAN's basically framed, or has historically been framed in 2 key ways as far as I'm concerned. One is geopolitical, which is Americans heavily supporting it from a political point of view because they realise that because of their own policies, they're stuck with a big kit vendor duopoly of Nokia and Ericsson. And they want vendor plurality, and they probably secretly also want some American company like Motorola used to be back in the day or whatever to step in and be a major player. And then the other one is supposed to be some combination of introducing extra competition all the way through the RAN, i.e. every little bit and bob within the RAN you can buy from someone else, which should drive down costs on every little bit because you've got so much more competition thrown in. And then there's also an increasing narrative where they talk about it as a sort of future-proofing thing.
Yeah.
It might not yield much return on investment right now. It might not be anything better than buying the whole lot from Nokia or Ericsson right now. But if you future-proof it by buying Open RAN kit now, then you'll be able to do all kinds of cool shit that we haven't quite identified in the future. Anyway, I think
the first 2 things that you talked about there are linked.
Right.
Because I think the idea with Open RAN, and this brings us on to the Samsung thing anyway that I wanted to
and I'll shut up now. You take it.
But I think the first 2 things you mentioned there, one it being a geopolitical thing, and the other one being it about you can buy all sorts of bits and bobs from other they're very much linked, because I think the idea was...
Yes. It's the vendor plurality thing.
Was vendor... So ideally what you maybe want to do is go, well, we don't want to use Huawei anymore, but we're worried about having Ericsson and Nokia, and there's been loads of consolidation, so there aren't any other companies that do this kind of stuff in the market. Well, let's just create another one from scratch, like setting up a TSMC or an Intel foundry or something, and it's as hard as doing that almost. It's like you can't just do that. These companies have got 150-year history in Ericsson's case, and similar with Nokia, no doubt. And they weren't always doing radios, obviously, but they're well-established old companies with a huge amount of talent, and just trying to create a company from scratch that does that stuff. $25 billion companies in terms of annual sales each year with big R&D budgets. Huawei even more like intimidating in those financial terms is not feasible. But you did have this huge array, actually, even before Open RAN was a thing, of specialists, guys that would do radios, but what they would have to do is go and work with one of the kit vendors like an Ericsson or a Nokia, because they couldn't serve telcos directly. They had to go into a systems
they owned the
integrator.
Interfaces. And
So they had to go and work through a systems integrator, which is basically what Nokia and Ericsson are, or Huawei even. So they couldn't like just go to a BT and say we want to sell you radios.
Yeah.
Because BT needs to get a full system because
Quite.
of this interface problem.
Yeah.
You know, it buys the radios from that company, and then all of a sudden it finds it can't connect them to the software that it's getting from somebody else. You know, because the interfaces have been closed, and you've tended to buy it all from one guy in the past. It being Ericsson, Nokia, you know, Huawei. And Open RAN was supposed to be a solution to that problem. You know, let's open the interfaces, and then these small innovative players, whether they're on the software side or the hardware side, can come along, serve a telco directly, can go and get its radios from one guy, and get its software from somebody else. Put
And
them
you've
all
got
together
names
like building a
like-
jigsaw, like bits of Lego from different sets. You
And
can,
what
you know,
what
create
would be
something.
the names that you most associate with these smaller? What list of names that typically come up in that context?
These days, the smaller ones, it's people like JMA Wireless in the US, or you know, I mean, you have people like Fujitsu, obviously in NEC in Japan. They're not small companies,
No.
but they're guys that have sort of played in that ecosystem of working through an Ericsson, perhaps, if in Fujitsu's case. You've got on the software side, I mean, there's a lot of radio players that are kind of, what is it, MTI, I think, and there's guys in the Far East that Combo, is it? I think there's a Hong Kong company. There's lots of these. There's Comba. There's lots of these companies in Asia, but on the software side, it'd be people like Mavenir. I mean, they're doing radios as well now.
Yeah.
Or Rakuten Symphony's obviously come into the market. They used to be Altiostar, but they bought that company.
And then you got ones that,
Wireless
I was
is
about to say
another one.
Parallel sort of burnt quite hot, and then did it? I mean, it had a really.
Well, they
tough
had a
time,
bad
didn't it?
2022 when they laid off a lot of staff,
Right.
like hundreds of employees. I mean, there were reports varying in like speculation about what it was as a percentage of the workforce, but people saying basically they cut half of their staff numbers. Now, when I spoke to, this is the story I wrote today, actually.
Okay.
Although it was referring to a comment that he made a few months ago. But when I spoke to Iago Tenorio, who's the head of network strategy for Vodafone, about where are the small players in the mix these days? You know, Open RAN was supposed to buoy these specialist companies, and yet we see operators still doing deals with big vendors like Samsung, if it's not Ericsson and Nokia. Where are these small guys? You were doing trials with Parallel Wireless and Mavenir, you know, all this. And he basically said, yeah, emotionally it's sad, and it's true. We don't, you know, we used to be using Parallel Wireless and nobody's talking about them anymore. You know, they're kind of not in the picture.
Yeah.
And Orange on record, MWC, I spoke to Laurent Leboucher, who's their group CTO. They have two kind of people in the CTO role. They have Bruno Zabib, who's the new guy. He came in from outside Orange last year, but they have the group CTO guy, who seems to be more involved in the nitty gritty. He's been there for a lot longer. Laurent Leboucher, he basically said, yeah, the small guys, it's not clear how they can play in the picture at the moment.
Does it?
You know,
Do you think one of the reasons for that is that the whole thing has lost a bit of momentum? There was a lot of hype around it
I don't
a few
think it's
years
lost
ago.
momentum. I think the problem with it is big companies like the big telcos still want to deal with a big player. They still want the open.
Bit back to the
Opening
corporatism
the
doesn't work with the EU.
interfaces-
It's just easier to deal with one big player.
Yeah, exactly. Opening the interfaces creates the possibility of mixing and matching components, like buying the two big ones, the radios, and then the actual kind of compute stuff, the baseband software, really.
Yeah. And to people, I mean, most people listening to this podcast will probably know more than I do about this, but there's a hell of a lot of processing that has to be done.
Yeah, I mean,
of
if
those
you think
signals.
about a traditional mast, your radio's at the top of the mast,
Yeah.
and then at the bottom of the mast, you've got servers that basically crunch all the numbers and ferry it onto
because
the next
basically
bit
to
of the
get
network.
all this data and voice and send it over airwaves requires a hell of a lot of technology at both ends.
Yeah.
In terms of encoding and decoding and processing and all that sort of thing.
So the radio picks up the signal and does some fancy stuff there, and then it basically passes it down to the servers that crunch all the numbers and do all the compute stuff.
Turn it into useful shit.
And those are the two main components of the radio access network, basically. Call it baseband. I mean, these days people use expressions like CUs and DUs, which are central units, and distributed units, which are different bits of that.
But let's call it baseband.
Yeah, and then the radio unit at the top. So those are the two main elements. And the whole idea of Open RAN originally, although it's become about other things as well now, but the whole original thing was it might be nice to create an environment where you can buy your radio units separately from the baseband units instead of having to get the whole thing in one package.
And there's traditionally been a proprietary interface.
Yeah, there's a front haul link between them that's called Bing CIPRI in the past.
Yeah.
And so the the ORAN Alliance, which is the kind of telco-led group that's really been sort of working on specs, came up with an alternative, which is this 7.2x, Open Front Haul 7.2x. In various formats now. There's various versions of 7.2x. It's like an iPhone. It's like, do you get Pro? Do you get the 10 model? Do you get the 11 model? But but they came up with an alternative that allows you to do that. The trouble is that even those open interfaces create the possibility of mixing and matching vendors, but they don't make the job that much easier. You've still got to do integration. You've still got to do testing. You've still got to...
It's got to work.
It's still got to work.
It's not plug and play.
It's not plug and play. And so going back to Iago Tenorio, who, by the way, is, I don't even introduce him properly, but he's head of network strategy at Vodafone.
Yep.
Don't think I mentioned that. But
he said a lot of Spaniards around in telecoms these days.
There are. And really smart guy and good to talk to and quite sort of upfront about what's going on as well. But a couple of years ago, he said to me, it's never going to be plug and play. You're still going to have to integrate stuff. You're still going to have to work on making sure these companies work sync properly. Just because you've got that open interface there, it doesn't make that necessarily any easier.
And this is coming from a bloke whose company, Vodafone, we've spoken about a lot, but they're massive cheerleaders for...
you've still got to have someone doing that systems integration job. You've still got this concern, which we've heard back in the day when he used to be at BT. He's left now, he's not at BT anymore, but I remember Neil McRae on record at an event talking about you don't want to use too many vendors because it becomes, the more vendors you have, it becomes more complicated. It drives up cost. I think that was the big thing. You're dealing with more companies, it tends to be more costly at the end of the day. This whole idea that it would be less expensive.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? There's a tension there. You'd think more competition drives down costs, and there's one intuitive that's easy to get your head around, but more competition means more moving parts, means more integration challenges.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the various sort of competing forces manifest themselves differently in different environments. But in telecoms, it's not necessarily a given that more players equals lower cost.
Yeah, totally. And anyway, the consequence, I think, of all this is that people want to buy, even though they're now saying they're going Open RAN and they're buying equipment with these specifications in the mix that allow you to do this in theory, they're still buying all the stuff from one vendor in most cases. And we had some figures coming out from Dell'Oro recently, which is this
market research firm,
company
who specialise in telecoms kit and stuff.
That by 2028, somewhere between 50% and 83% of all the Open RAN projects in the world will be single vendor Open RAN. So let's take the midpoint of that, roughly 2/3 or whatever. And by that stage, by the way, Open RAN is somewhere like, I think 20% of the market, maybe 20 to 30% of the market. So you're still talking about the vast majority of deployments being, whether they're single vendor, without these interfaces included in the mix, or whether they're Open RAN in name, it's still going to be mainly single vendor. It's still mainly going to be one vendor in the mix because it's just a lot more convenient to do that.
And that kind of brings us back to your story that you wrote this week.
With Samsung. Now, I think people like Mavenir, the smaller guys like Rakuten and Mavenir and Parallel, they saw this coming, by the way, because they started out, this is the nonsense of Open RAN, that it would buoy specialists and make it easier for them to fit in and sell directly to telcos. But what have all those companies done over the last few years? They've all gone into other areas. Mavenir used to be a software company. They used to do the baseband software that we were talking about, the stuff that works in the servers, which would come from someone like HP or Dell, and they'd use Intel chips. But the software on top of that would be Mavenir's software.
Yep.
They now do radio units.
I know. Pierre was there. We shot a thing at Mobile World Congress with tons of their little grey boxes behind us.
They're a radio unit developer. They do systems integration. Parallel Wireless, another one. They've gone down, even though they've had this huge headcount cut and they've had to slash resources. They're not only now saying they do software, they're doing radio unit design. Rakuten Symphony's tried to add all sorts of things to its portfolio, and they're very much in the systems integration side. The problem is none of them have the scale of Ericsson and Nokia, or Samsung, to bring in the one big player that I think is actually doing quite well out of Open RAN, who's not one of the kind of perceived to be one of the incumbents. And a single vendor Open RAN setup, if that's the way it's going to go, it's obviously going to favour the companies that can do everything. If you're going to be single vendor Open RAN, you have to go to somebody that can do everything and that has the resources to spend on it and that does it well. And people are going to worry about buying stuff from a Mavenir or a Parallel Wireless when they've got these pretty small research and development budgets that are now spread more thinly than ever. This was the whole idea. You can put all of your R&D muscle into one area instead of having to spread it across everything to be able to fit in. But they can't now because they're going down this road of trying to be all things to all, to the operators.
Yeah.
So Samsung has been the big winner, I think, from Open RAN. So going to a company that the people that are our colleagues will be much happier for me to mention, rather than Dell'Oro Omdia.
Yeah.
I spoke with Remy Pascal, who does all the kind of number crunching on the RAN side. And he was saying that the kind of number one player in the world at the moment, if you look at it just from an Open RAN perspective, is Samsung.
Yeah.
They're the guys who've basically picked up most of the work. And I'm not easily impressed when I go around and talk to these guys. I always sort of try and find things to sort of pick up on, and you haven't got this and you haven't got that and you haven't thought about this, and you try and be skeptical as a journalist. But I was pretty impressed when I went and met them at MWC with the kind of approach they've taken and how many bases they're trying to cover, and then you talk to the operators and everybody's pretty enthusiastic about Samsung as the one that they're going to use other than Ericsson and Nokia.
So that's like, so people listening, if it wasn't already obvious to them, it's clear that you're saying that they're really one to watch.
They are the ones in Europe at the moment. They're in a situation where they are. So Laurent Leboucher, to come back to the Orange Group CTO, when I was chatting to him, and he was very downbeat about smaller vendors like Mavenir, which is one he called out and said it's not quite clear how they fit, these smaller guys, and he actually specifically named Mavenir. They're not
going to like that.
But he said it because it's in the story I wrote today, so it was on record.
Sorry.
And then he also said in the same breath, we've decided to go pretty much wholeheartedly in with Samsung.
Right.
And they've obviously got this deal in. He's very much talking about the arrangement they've got in Romania, I think, where they're doing trial work with Vodafone on a shared rural network. But the way he was talking about them, and they haven't announced a commercial job with Samsung yet, as far as I'm aware, Orange. But it sounds like they're the company that's like in the hot seat. As far as Orange's plans for Open RAN, if they're going to introduce anybody that's going to come in and swap stuff out that they've got at the moment, then it's going to be Samsung. And very much the same goes for Vodafone. So Vodafone's got this, it's not only announced a similar thing in Romania where they're using Samsung for their Open RAN projects in urban areas where they're not sharing a network with Orange. They also have this 170,000 site swap out they keep talking about doing, the tender. 170,000 site tender across Europe and Africa in the next, it's ongoing at the moment. And Samsung has been their vendor of choice, clearly, with Open RAN. They're doing that in the UK. You wrote about this recently with the
Vodafone thing. Yeah.
With the mixing of their software with NEC.
That's right. Yeah.
But generally, they're more heavily reliant on Samsung. Basically, they're taking radios and software from them. It's not all single vendor. There is an opportunity for some multi-vendor in the mix, obviously, because they've got this site now that they're talking about with NEC. But Samsung is the player they're leaning on extremely heavily, clearly, for their Open RAN deployments, and they're doing that in Romania as well. And you'd have to say that this 170,000 site tender, things look pretty good for Samsung at the moment, I would say.
Right.
And then I've also heard, and I can't say where this came from, that Telefonica is looking at them quite seriously as well in a couple of places.
So one last thing I was saying, then I'm going to move it on because I know you've got a hard stop because you've got some journalism to do, is two things. One, a lot of, I remember hearing a lot of recent like Open RAN announcements. Maybe they were from like the incumbents, like someone like Ericsson, and I was skeptical because I kept hearing terms like compatible, Open RAN compatible, and Open RAN compliant.
Yeah,
and I think I remember making a joke in an email to our freelancers saying compatible and compliant sounds like good qualities in a romantic partner.
Yeah.
But that joking aside, that felt like code for saying this is Open RAN compatible, this is Open RAN compliant. So it's sort of future proofing, but it's not really living the Open RAN dream now.
Yeah.
And that seems to be, so you're saying...
Well, I mean, that makes me even more sceptical that it's going to be multi-vendor Open RAN. Is what's happened on the... So Samsung, feasibly, could probably have come in and done some of this stuff without it being Open RAN. I mean, they obviously can't do necessarily an NEC and Samsung match up at a site without it being Open RAN. But if they're going to come along and be the vendor that does most of the stuff, they could do all of that without Open RAN being there. You didn't necessarily need Open RAN to have them as an alternative to Huawei. If that was your goal, is to get another big vendor in the mix, you didn't necessarily need Open RAN to be there. I think the position of the European incumbents, the Ericssons and Nokias, which want to be seen to be playing ball, don't they? They want to be seen to be doing what the telcos are asking, and therefore they've pushed to make their equipment, their products, like you said, that word compatible or compliant, make sure that it incorporates those specifications. But whether that means that they're going to be participating in projects where you have multiple vendors in the mix remains to be said. I'm dubious it will. I mean, the big one that everybody talks about is the AT&T deal with Ericsson in the US with this $14 billion.
But that's all compatible and compliant.
It's compatible and compliant, but the problem is it's still, they're even more heavily reliant on one supplier now than they were before they introduced Ericsson.
What about this vendor plurality dream?
Well, this is why I don't think it's going to... the only vendor plurality to me that I see coming out of this is that instead of having Huawei, Ericsson, Nokia, you've got Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung.
Yeah.
Let's say. That's the sort of vendor plurality. Now, I could see opportunities where you might get some radio vendors mixed in some areas. You know, like Ericsson's working with Fujitsu in the AT&T project, apparently. We don't know what percentage of sites Fujitsu might serve. But one of the problems, and this is why I'm quite curious about the Vodafone, NEC, Samsung thing, and I haven't talked to them about this the way you have, so I don't know. But if you talk to Nokia, if you talk to the guy who's in charge of all this for Nokia, Tommy Wito, his view on Massive MIMO, and this is, I think, the reason why the Massive MIMO work that we see going, Massive MIMO being the most advanced 5G tech, on the sort of antenna side. If you see where it generally goes with Massive MIMO, even with these Open RAN compliant specs, people are generally still taking the baseband and the radios from the same vendor. And the reason for that is the algorithms between the radio unit and the baseband unit which are incredibly complex algorithms. You can split the, you can have that split where you're getting the components from different suppliers, but the algorithms still have to match, right? So what that means is, and this is kind of paraphrasing him, that either the radio unit vendor has to change its algorithms, or the baseband unit vendor has to change its algorithms, or maybe both of them do, and they reach some kind of accommodation. But at the end of the day, you're essentially talking about companies having to adapt their, the algorithms that they've taken great pride in developing, by the way, to make it all work well. And the only alternative to doing that is to fall back on simpler algorithms. But if you do that, then you're at a performance disadvantage against equipment that's kind of done in the traditional way. So his take on this is essentially that with Open RAN at the moment, if it's genuine Open RAN and it's not just in name, but you're actually using different companies, in Massive MIMO, you aren't going to get the same performance that you get as you do in a traditional network. And
one other thing...
And that's a barrier to any multi-vendor deal, basically.
Yep, I totally hear you. And one other thing I want to mention, just before I move it on, because we're running out of time, you mentioned Dell'Oro earlier. They came out with a thing this week that we wrote up. They came up with their market sizing for the total global telecoms equipment market for 2023. And the top line was that they were surprised to see a 5% year-on-year decline.
Yeah. This is all equipment as well as
all
fixed line. And
it's a fixed line, it's everything.
Yeah.
And it's relevant that you flag that up, because I want to talk about vendor shares in a sec. But that 5% decline was interesting, especially as it seems to have mainly happened in the second half of last year as well. Things obviously kind of went off a cliff relatively in terms of spending.
I mean, that has to be mainly RAN, I guess, because it would probably form the bulk anyway. It tends to be a bit...
Ericsson is a similar size to Nokia just on doing like mobile stuff alone. Whereas Nokia, as we know from last week from talking to Rafa, does all kinds of shit.
But Nokia's
which is actually how he phrased it. He's VP of all kinds of shit.
Nokia's fixed line business, I noticed in the final, because I only looked at this earlier today or this week.
Right.
And I sort of feel like I didn't lean on him enough at the time now. But their fixed line business did really badly in the final quarter of 2023. Like actually worse than the mobile business. So their mobile business, by the way, just to put it in context, their sales at their mobile units in the final 3 months of 2023 dropped by 17% year on year, and Ericsson's were down 23% year on year. Those are reported figures, not constant currency. But I think in Ericsson's case, the constant currency is exactly the same. It's a 23% drop.
Right.
That's a massive drop. Yeah?
It is.
That's not good.
It's not ideal. Can I say two things? Can I say two things about you not asking Rafa those awkward questions last week?
Well, I just didn't know. I hadn't looked at the
Well, so that's the first thing I was going to say is we don't do much preparation for these podcasts, which I'm sure will come as a massive surprise to our audience. So it's not like we're sitting there because, before we do the podcast, we're normally both writing a story during the day and doing all kinds of other shit and editing stuff.
Yeah.
And we probably could make time if we were a bit more conscientious than we are. Probably could make time to do a bit more research. But I mean, I kind of willfully like to come into these things a bit fresh because that leads on to my second point, which is it's supposed to be a conversation. It's not supposed to be a journalistic ambush.
Yeah.
And, this guy's flown over from Spain, presumably he did some other shit as well, but he's come over here. And what you don't want to do, like, I don't know, this is a complete tangent. I don't know if you heard about Elon Musk and Don Lemon this week. So Don Lemon is this American establishment broadcast journalist. I think he used to be at CNN, and he got canned by CNN because they're having a nightmare because no one's fucking watching it. And Elon Musk rather counterintuitively did a deal with him that Don Lemon could do a show, especially on X, Twitter. Elon Musk's interest in that being obviously just to drive more traffic to Twitter and make it a bigger going concern.
Don Lemon needs to put food on the table.
And Don Lemon. So, they're helping each other out, even though they seem to come from different directions and culturally and politically. Anyway, Don Lemon did this interview with him and just asked him the usual kind of old school journalist shitty questions, like ambush questions. And I fucking hate that. I can see how there's a place for it, especially with politicians. Sometimes they need to be ambushed because they're such slimy, disingenuous bastards.
Anyway, it might have been asked.
Well, I don't think he was. And anyway, cut a long story short, Elon Musk went, deal's off, fuck you.
Oh, really? So he obviously wasn't expecting
it. No, exactly. And then people are coming out with this disingenuous stuff going, oh, you're not so into free speech now. And Elon Musk had an answer to it. He's like, he's welcome to publish it all he wants. I'm just not going to pay the oops. You got to bleep that out. I'm not supposed to say that word.
Is that word not allowed still?
I think that's the one that we try not to say.
It's a bit of a nasty word.
I think that's the one word we try not to say. Let's see if Pierre spots it. I'm not going to pay the bloke, he said. Anyway, the reason I bring that up is like journalistic ambushes. I'm not into them, and certainly in the context of this podcast, I think if we'd be more prepared and backdraft into a corner and went, how come your business unit did so shit last year? I just don't think that's in keeping with
Don Lemon's back down the soup kitchen, is he?
Yeah, it's all gone horribly wrong.
It's going to be Wagyu beef or whatever tonight, but now it's back to McDonald's.
Quite. He just couldn't help himself. I mean, he obviously felt adversarial towards Elon Musk, and that's fine. He's entitled to. But yeah, I think it was a bit weird, given that they got a business relationship with each other, for him to be quite as hostile as he apparently was. And apparently the whole interview was like really awkward.
Oh, okay.
I mean, that's another thing I don't like about those sort of journalistically adversarial things. Let's say it's you and me talking, and I go, Ian, well, what? I heard a story that one time you shouted at a kid and made it cry. What have you got to say about that? And just putting you into a little corner and finding the shittiest thing you've ever done and sort of defining you by that. And I'm not saying you ever have done that, incidentally.
Young children.
It was oddly specific.
Yeah, I know. Where did I suddenly get that from? Well, believe me, in my mind, there were much more salacious things that I thought of, hypothetically accusing him of. But given my verbal slip a minute ago, I thought I'd keep myself under control.
Apparently, Musk thought that Don Lemon would be different without being tied to CNN. He thought it was too much of the same.
Yeah,
I guess that's his excuse.
Which is his way of saying that I thought he was a dick. But anyway, what's up?
Let's have another one.
One for the road. Do you want another Hazy Jane? Yeah. Anyway, so getting back to, I don't know how that tangent happened. Oh yeah, we were talking about why you not asking Rafa that question. So that's my answer to that. Anyway, quickly getting back, and then I want to quickly bring up my last thing. Dell'Oro came out with this thing, and they looked at vendor share, and it's really interesting. So it says equipment include broadband access, microwave and optical transport, mobile core network and RAN, SP router and switch. Huawei's got 30% of the global market, up from 28% last year. And Nokia's second on 15, which is flat from last year. Ericsson's third on 13, which is down from 14% last year. And I thought an interesting thing there is within that, given what you were just talking about, Ian, Samsung, according to Dell'Oro, this is total market, is 2%, down from 3% last year.
Well, do you know what that is? I
Go
can
on.
explain that to you.
Yeah.
That is because of India. Because India had this massive 5G rollout.
And it all went with the big guys.
Well, so Samsung had been very big on market share in India because it was the only company involved in Reliance Jio's network.
Right. Oh,
And
I didn't
then
realise it was the only company.
It was the only company that did 4G for Reliance Jio. They had a single vendor, a proper single vendor in terms of
That
not
really
just
is.
the only vendor at the sites, but the only vendor
stop.
across the whole country.
Yeah.
And when they went to 5G, they decided that they weren't going to just be solely reliant on Samsung, and they introduced Nokia and Ericsson alongside it. So it lost quite a bit of market share. And
Fair enough.
India is, if you think about India, it's a little bit like, it's not quite the same, but it's a little bit like thinking about China. You know, the reason that Huawei always does so well in these market share things, even though it's been shut out of European countries, is because there's only like 2 base stations in the UK and there's like a million of them in China.
Well, the fourth in this Dell'Oro Pi is ZTE with 11% of the global market share. And that's almost entirely China, isn't it?
Yeah, because they're not even. I mean, they're in some African countries.
Listen,
but so Samsung has the other reason Samsung's not done well, by the way, just to sort of add to India.
Yeah.
This is from Remy at Omdia, is that they had a really good year in the US the year before, when there was a lot of activity in terms of rolling out sites to do with Samsung. And it's quite, because all these cuts, by the way, the 23% down at Ericsson and the 17% down at Nokia, that's mainly to do with North America. Like the US operators have just basically stopped spending money on RAN.
No, North America's a car crash spend-wise.
They've been using inventory that they built up in the past, and Samsung will have been a victim of that as well.
Okay.
And it doesn't have much existing business in Europe. So what I'm talking about with this thing, the things it could do with Orange and Vodafone is very much future opportunities.
Yes.
So
well, quite.
That's why it's done.
I wasn't positioning this as some kind of gotcha.
By the way,
and a
I don't
contradiction.
own Samsung shares. I'm not.
No.
I know I sound unusually upbeat about.
Well,
the company,
and Samsung's
but,
one of the most impressive companies in the world. I mean, it's one of the biggest. It's incredibly diverse. It does all kinds of shit.
Yeah.
They're very impressive. So fair play to them. Okay, I'm going to bring up my last thing because thanks to you, I've only got 9 minutes to talk about it.
Sorry.
So, well, it's not thanks to you going on, although that's part of it. It's because you've got a hard stop because you've got to ring someone up, innit?
Well, I don't have to ring someone up at a specific time.
You can.
I just said in a couple of hours.
Okay, so we've got a little bit of wriggle
stress.
room.
Yeah.
Okay, I was taking you literally.
Yeah.
So in a similar compressed way at the end of last week's pod, I spoke about how in Europe they've got this big bit of regulation called the Digital Markets Act, which is basically designed to force big internet platforms, which principally means American ones, into introducing a bit more competition into the domains that they control. So the most obvious example of this is the iOS and Android operating systems. If you've got an iPhone, everything you do on that iPhone is controlled by Apple, and Apple extracts a 30% tax on every penny you spend on that phone with a third party. Which is, if you bear in mind that I think people like Visa and MasterCard, it's more like 1 or 2%.
Yeah.
So the only way Apple could be extracting 30% as a payment processor versus 1 or 2% by Visa and MasterCard is because it's got a de facto monopoly on the iOS platform. And that's what the DMA, I'm always having a go at the EU, but actually one of the really good things about the EU being corporatist, about it being so big, is it takes something that big to take on other companies that are that big as well, that have $1 trillion market caps or whatever they've got. Is it $1 trillion? Am I exaggerating?
Who's worth $1 trillion?
Have some of them got $1 trillion market caps? Pierre?
Oh, yeah.
Who?
Like the big tech, like Apple and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
it's more than $1 trillion.
Okay, I was just making sure that I wasn't.
Multiple trillions.
Apple kissed 3 trillion.
3 trillion. Yeah, I thought so. I just thought maybe I've gone mad.
Passé.
Trillion. I lose $1 trillion down the back of the sofa, mate.
They don't get up these days.
You want several trillions. Otherwise, you're losing.
Anyway, so to take on a $1 trillion company, you've got to be a pretty big organisation yourself, and the EU is one of those. So the DMA is their way of going, look, stop taking the piss. And one of the sort of headline, the sort of flagship initiatives is whether or not Apple, and all this applies to Android as well, but for some reason Apple seems to be the one that gets the more publicity and is in the crosshairs. But I think Apple's just a proxy. I think anything that happens to Apple will apply to Google Android as well, because they charge 30%. There's a classic example of how a duopoly leads to cartel behaviour. How come they both charge exactly the same fucking premium? If there's only competition, one of them will be charging 25% to try and lure developers over.
That's a good sign of a monopoly as well. Have you seen what NVIDIA's gross margin is?
No.
77%.
Wow. Just full stop.
And it went up 10. I looked at this. It went up 10 percentage points in like 2 years.
Because it's all the AI chips.
Yeah, it's because you can't get them from anybody else, and they've like constrained supply, and they just basically charge what they want. I think.
Yeah, so. They're like OPEC for AI chips, aren't they? So there's this games developer Epic that makes Fortnite that all of us who've got teenage boys will know all about. Although I presume teenage girls do it as well. I don't think Izzy ever did. My girl who's 17 now, she never played Fortnite and that sort of thing.
Well, I do know teenage girls, but they're all in Slovakia. They probably do play it, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
But Epic was basically, it had the hump because if you play Fortnite over iOS, not only do they have to pay Apple 30% of what you... I think the game is free to download, so their business model is all freemium. It's all about in-app purchases. And every time you buy an in-app purchase, buy some glittery digital suit of armor or whatever the fuck that you might want to buy on Fortnite, you still have to get... Apple gets 30% of that. It gets 30% of everything. It's the most egregious rent-seeking.
Yeah.
And Epic, understandably, has got the arsehole about that, and it's been very vigorous in lobbying against it. And it basically thought it had got a big win with the Digital Markets Act, DMA for short. And it was forced within Europe. Apple was forced to give Epic a developer account to develop its own store. So then you could go on to in theory, you could go onto a separate app on iOS and have a link direct to Epic, whereby your commercial relationship with Epic would then be outside of the ring fence of Apple's 30% tax. And then all you've got is your direct commercial relationship with them, like you have with any other provider. And then after about a couple of weeks, Apple went, no, actually, we're canning that developer account. And the only reason it seemed to give was that you'd just been dissing us on Twitter.
Right.
And so, they always couch it in these, well, you've gone against our terms and conditions. But their terms and conditions seem to be very capricious and very petty, which basically said that you can only say nice shit about us in public, otherwise you're going to get... In other words, the way in which Apple has, in my view, tried to comply with the DMA in bad faith is like, okay, we'll go along with your rules, but we're going to attach so many shitty strings to it that we might as well have not bothered.
Yeah.
And so they did that. They canned their account, and that's how I left it at the end of the last pod. But I think by the time we were talking, our mate Thierry Breton with the big haircut, who likes to look over his glasses in an imperious way at peons and serfs.
He looks like a total knob.
He does. I think he looks like someone's aunt, but there we go.
Sorry, Thierry, if you're listening.
He just sort of went, I'll do my shit fresh. He went, I don't think so somehow.
He's not coming on now.
He's not coming on, I know. He was going to be, he was on the short list, wasn't he? And basically he had a word, and Apple shat themselves. Like, I've never seen, my headline was Apple forced by EU into humiliating U-turn. There's a bit of schadenfreude on my part there, because anytime someone as big and as rent-seeking as Apple is forced to climb down a little bit, it kind of pleases me. And as I think I joked with Rafa last week, it's almost like, because I'm not a fan of the EU, I'm not a fan of Apple's business practices. I'm a big fan of their devices, just not their business practices.
But you don't buy their devices.
Well, I've got iPads. I've got iPads at home. But I can still respect them. I just think like the Pixel phone I've got costs about half of your iPhone, and I don't think it's got half the functionality. So it's a simple value for money thing for me.
It's not half. No.
Fortunately, my iPhone
It's cheaper, but it's
cheap.
not half. Come on.
Well, it's about 500 quid.
Yeah, but
An iPhone costs about $1,000 on the whole.
that's
doesn't
the Pro. You're not comparing the
it?
same.
Okay, all right. I'm not comparing
just-
apples with apples. Anyway, but I still personally can't justify the premium when it comes to things like Macs and phones. But you two obviously can, and that's fine. I certainly don't want to get
have to buy
into.
my iPhone.
I don't want to get into a fucking
Or
religious
my Mac,
dispute on it.
actually. None of my Mac equipment is owned by
Well, and I actually think the exception of people like Pierre who work in the sort of creative areas and video and image processing, I've heard that there are distinct advantages to Macs. So fair enough. Anyway, so they basically had to do a U-turn, and they gave Epic its account back. And Thierry Breton did a very imperious tweet. I'm going to read it like verbatim. He goes, "I take note with satisfaction." No, I'm going to stop doing a French accent.
Do you in the
No, I
accent?
can't do a prolonged French accent with Pierre in the room. It's fucking ridiculous.
Get Pierre to read it then.
Yeah, but that doesn't count. That's just his accent.
Yeah, but it's still French. We need to
Pierre,
have a
do you think
French person
you
reading
could
it
ham
or
up
in
a French accent? Would
You
you
mean
know how to be like
force it?
or like Peter Sellers, lot of Inspector Clouseau type of thing?
Because his accent's not a very strong French accent.
Well, exactly. That's why I'm wondering if he can really.
I would just make no effort.
Yeah, exactly. You sound more like Ronan from Omdia. He's got a much stronger French accent.
Oh,
than
does
you.
he? Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. Ronan. He's definitely got a stronger accent than
Oh
Peter.
no.
Well, no. Oh, okay. There we go. Well, Ronan. If you're English. Anyway, Thierry Breton says, "I take note with satisfaction that following our contacts, Apple decided to backtrack its decision on Epic exclusion
He must
from
have
day
felt
two."
so good going back home.
Oh yeah,
This reminds me of the
it was like being high-fived down the corridor.
there's the Rest is History podcast where they were doing, I think, one on Napoleon and like reading out one of his letters to Josephine. And he goes, "I'm not going to read this with a French accent because it'll be stupid." And then he goes, "Yeah, actually, I am." And it's like, no.
Well, I mean, all of us, I grew up watching like the Pink Panther films with Peter
Yeah,
Sellers
it just
being
sounds
Inspector
like
Clouseau.
Inspector Clouseau.
And that's basically what we've got as a frame of reference. Or we've got something like Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Yes,
Because
fucked in your general direction.
yeah, your mother was a hamster and your father smelt of elderberries. Now go away, or I'll taunt you a second time.
Is that the one where they go Camelot and then the guy goes, "It's only a model"?
That's it. Yeah.
But is the guy French? Who says that?
No, I don't. There's no French people in Monty Python, but they have this castle that they go to, and it's got John Cleese being this obnoxious French bloke at the top, and they go fêcher la vache, and they launch a cow at them. Anyway,
That's ridiculous.
it's a hilarious film. Anyway, and so Breton goes on to say, from day two, DMA is already showing very concrete results! ! I just thought it was hilarious as a sort of climb down. Apple had just been giving it large and going, "Nah, fuck you, we're going to do what we want." And then within 24 hours, they backed down. So I enjoyed that. But then, by the time we got to the start of this week, I wrote another story headlined, "Apple throws down the gauntlet to the EU over the DMA once more." And basically they did the thing again where what happened in this is that they came up with a developer update that was titled "More Options for Apps Distributed in the European Union," and just came up with all these options to allowing people like Epic to do what they want, but again attached tons and tons of strings to it and just made it so onerous that no one would ever do it. And so I think this is, and so once again, Breton et al. Have got to decide whether to launch a cow at them or whatever. And the most interesting thing I find about it all, fêcher la vache. Is fêcher a word in French, or is that them just
No, that's just like
Franglicising it?
As in he's doing fetching.
French. Yeah. And so, but the interesting thing about it all, if you leave the sort of tribal side of and picking a team, is this is what happens. You've got a battle of wills between two enormous organisations, Apple on one side, EU on the other. And EU says do this, and Apple says, yeah, all right, but does it in a really half-assed, bad faith way, and the EU goes, no, you've done that wrong. And can you imagine like being a kid where your teacher or your parent tells you to do something and you do it the most minimal shitty way you possibly can. Yeah. Like they go, Ian, do the washing up, and so you wash one dish, and they go, there you are.
Yeah,
I've done the fucking
washing
washing
this
up
regularly during the week. So
you encounter it maybe with Alex. Yeah, exactly. So Apple's kind of behaving like a teenager in this, and the EU's behaving like the parent.
Just dragging their feet.
Yeah, but it's going to keep going backwards and forwards. And actually, as I wrote in I think in this piece, Apple maybe is doing everyone a favour by stress testing the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, because it's probably badly drafted. Most of these things are.
Yeah.
In that they lay down these rules, and then people at Apple have got the resources to have incredibly clever and hardworking lawyers come and read between the lines and go, okay, how can we wriggle through this, that, and the other? How can we manipulate this whole thing to best serve our interests? Which I don't condemn them for doing. That's their job.
Yeah.
And so I think this is going to go backwards and forwards for quite a while. So that's one interesting thing, and I'll just keep ranting on, especially as we're running out of time, because there's one other thing I wanted to flag up. Quite often these Scott Pacino pet topic things end up being monologues, and I apologise, Ian. I'm not trying to exclude you. It's just that they normally come in right at the end when we're running out of time. So I'm trying to squeeze tons of stuff in. There was a bit of legislation that went through the House of Representatives in the US this week, where it's basically designed to outlaw TikTok in the States. Now, I don't use TikTok, but I guarantee and actually my kids don't. My kids don't either, but I gather it's very popular, especially among American youth. It's become the YouTube of like short, viral phone videos.
Yeah, YouTube wasn't short enough.
Yeah, exactly. Shorter, so it's like sort of 30-second videos, and
where does it go next?
The cliche is like teenage girls filming themselves doing a little dance to fucking Taylor Swift or whatever. So obviously it's probably right and proper.
Might even be Taylor Swift doing it,
or it might even be but I mean the traffic and the audience to it is enormous.
Yeah.
And so this is the issue. So the Americans decided TikTok's out of order. Now, it just so happens that TikTok is also Chinese owned. So the reason they want to ban it, the stated reason they want to ban TikTok is because it's Chinese owned. Same reason they want to ban Huawei. Basically, if it's Chinese owned, then the Chinese Communist Party are basically using it to come up with, to do dastardly things to us, whether it's spy on us or.
And by the way, it's completely different in China.
Yes.
Is it?
That makes it more dodgy to me. In China, it's full of like educational things.
Well, that's the cliche. I need to see it. I've heard that repeated lots of times in lots of different settings. That's the cliche. I mean, my understanding is it doesn't even exist in China. It's got a different name, some Chinese name that I can't remember.
But it is the same company, same logo.
But yes, I mean, you're right in that everything's much more censored in China, and a lot of the wacky stuff that comes up on TikTok in the US probably wouldn't be allowed in China. And as you say, that the narrative cliche is it's nothing but people talking about how great maths is or some shit like that. The reason I'm slightly skeptical about that narrative is it feeds into a broader geopolitical and chauvinistic narrative of like, how come we allow our kids to be debased and just worry about pop songs and whatever other stupid shit, whereas they're all just advancing themselves and getting better. Yeah. It sounds a bit simplistic. It sounds a bit binary to me.
Yeah.
But let's assume it's true. Pierre's heard it. I've heard it.
China's plan to dumbify the youth of
well, exactly. That's part of the narrative. And so there's two reasons why the American politicians want to ban it. One is because they think there's a data security thing where they're basically spying on us via TikTok. And the other one is the dumbify thing that we were just talking about, and it's not just, it's also like culture war stuff. Like maybe they're promoting everyone getting preoccupied with things like trans and other stuff that everyone gets their knickers in a twist about, whereas they're more focused on more important things like fucking science or whatever.
Yeah.
But in the T's and C's, it says that it can see keystroke in other apps. Which is quite scary. Yeah. I've never.
Yeah, well,
nobody looks at those T and C's. That's
T's
the problem.
Or that in isolation is an interesting thing. And I think there'd be an argument for there to be regulation to say you can never have that facility within an app, that you can see keystrokes in other apps. That the default should always be that unless the app is active, it's deriving no data from your phone use. I'm sure there is all kinds of nasty, leaky shit in TikTok. But the counterpoint, and I haven't necessarily picked a team on this. My natural libertarian urge is any time when you want to ban an entire app that apparently 170 million people in the States use alone, it rankles with my libertarian instincts.
India banned it apparently with no notice, and they were fine. I don't know.
Yeah. So the counter arguments. So those are the arguments in favour are basically it's Chinese and therefore dodgy. And then there are various sort of things within that. The counter arguments are, one, tons of Americans already use it, and isn't it out of order to just tell them they can't use a thing that they're using? In terms of general civil liberties way. If the UK decide to ban Apple, Pierre, for whatever reason, it'd be out of order to you as an individual.
If the UK...
Yeah. I mean, of course they wouldn't. But, hypothetically, or something else some other brand that you're keen on. It could be if they just decided to ban a digital brand that you're keen on, it would in some way be infringing on your personal rights and your personal liberties. So that's one argument against it. TikTok's lobbying has been also to talk about their economic impact in the US. They seem to reckon their total contribution to GDP in 2023 was 24.2 billion. I mean, they would have pulled that number out their arse from somewhere. I mean, some of it's direct, some of it's indirect, some of it's induced, whatever that means. But they reckon even direct is 9.2 billion.
What's this 9.2 billion figure?
Contribution to US GDP by TikTok.
Much, is it?
No, I guess not. But anyway,
that's pathetic.
Fair enough.
That's even more reason to ban them
because it's not enough. And then you've got sort of libertarian Congress people like Rand Paul, just basically talking about how it tramples on constitutional rights of freedom of speech and that sort of thing. And my biggest objection to it is, firstly, I think the burden of proof hasn't been met that it is a Chinese spy app. Just like with Huawei, and I've often pushed back on the Huawei stuff, the assumption is it must be a spy app because it's owned by China, but there's no smoking gun evidence. There is circumstantial evidence. I'm not going to discount that, but there's no smoking gun evidence. But my biggest issue with it is I think this is like, do you remember a couple of years ago, I spent a lot of time writing up the Twitter files that where Elon Musk, when he bought Twitter, had leaked a bunch of internal correspondence to independent journalists like Matt Taibbi.
Yeah.
And it basically revealed that the US security state, FBI, CIA, National Security Agency, Homeland Security, there's so many alphabet agencies they got there that are all to do with security, have basically been leaning heavily on all social media to censor according to their stipulations. And often that's political censorship. Like what's very well known is there was political censorship over a story the New York Post wrote just before the last US general election, so that would have been 2020, that linked Joe Biden's son with all kinds of corruption in the Ukraine.
Right.
And this is before the Ukraine war, incidentally. And there was a story because his son, I think, used to be a drug abuser. And one time when he was off his tits, he'd left one of his laptops in a repair shop and never picked it up again. And apparently the repair guy, after a certain amount of time, is allowed to get into it if no one picks it up. Right. And he got into it, and he was obviously politically antagonistic to Biden, so he went and shared it with someone like Rudy Giuliani. Cut a long story short, there was some evidence that would have been very damaging to Joe Biden in the build-up to that election. And there was a hell of a lot of pressure put on social media to ban the dissemination of this New York Post. And New York Post's a major, it's like the Mail or something. Yeah. It's a major paper, to basically ban the dissemination of this story, and it was successful. You couldn't even share it on direct messages. If I wanted to DM at that time that New York Post story to you, I was banned. I would have been blocked from doing it on WhatsApp or whatever.
Right.
So there's lots of evidence of the US security state meddling in the internet and in social media for political ends. And I think it's understandable because back in the day, let's say people got nearly all their information from newspapers. Back to the corporatism thing we were talking about, there would have just been a few publishers you could lean on and go, look, if you know what's good for you, I would fucking bury that story. Days. Yeah, whatever. Yeah, I would bury that story. Whereas now it's so diffuse. It's a lot harder to control, but the one point of control you can have is the platform owners. This is where the two stories are kind of linked together. You've got this oligopoly of platform owners, which is what the DMA is designed for. It's designated only 6 companies as platform owners. I think Apple, Amazon, Meta/Facebook, Google, Twitter, and ByteDance, who owns TikTok.
Right.
They're the only 6 it's designated as mega platform owners that come under the auspices of this DMA. Anyway, cut a long story short, and I better stop soon because we're way past when you wanted to stop.
I think they're way off on that, by the way.
Say that again. Elaborate, sorry.
Well, this designating platform owners, I mean, they're very much talking about it from a sort of free speech perspective there. Is that the angle?
No, that's where I come in. No, they're just basically saying that these platform owners have a disproportionate influence over the entire digital space. And so certain rules must apply uniquely to them because they control so much of the space. I find it a very arbitrary way of looking at platforms. It is a bit arbitrary.
Because the ones that I'd view as the big platforms, to me, that are far more concerning than some of the companies on that list are AWS, Microsoft, and Google. Those are the 3 big platforms to me. Those are the world's 3 big platforms that we need to be concerned about.
Oh, I see. So you're saying, you're coming at it more from a public cloud perspective.
Public clouds underpins all of this stuff.
No, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just clarifying what you're saying. Whereas you think the DMA is coming at it more from a sort of superficial consumer-facing point of view.
That's very consumer-facing because if X died tomorrow, like whatever it is,
it wouldn't be that consequential.
No one would give a shit. Who gives a toss if that company goes out of business? Nobody, really, except for Elon Musk, maybe. Whereas if AWS goes down or Microsoft Azure goes down, not that it's very likely, but if they did just suddenly disappear, let's say that we took them off the planet and stripped all the data centers out, we'd be in a right old state.
Be a fucking issue. No, you're right. And maybe they do have other bits of legislation, and I'm the last to instinctively defend the EU, but the DMA could just be looking at it from one perspective, and they could have what you were talking about covered. Maybe they do, maybe they don't.
I think this is the problem with regulation, though, is that it's not very clear on how they're approaching this. What do they mean by platforms, and why are you worrying about it from this perspective rather than the UK big investigation at the moment is into cloud companies being too dominant in the UK, and they're very much looking at it from an AWS, Google, Microsoft perspective.
Indeed. We'll have to bring that up next week.
To me, than this whole ByteDance being a big thing to worry about. I mean.
Well, listen, I better wrap it up because you got your thing to do. I'm getting to that point where these 4 beers I just had are fucking catching up with me.
Yeah.
I just want to round it off by saying, I mean, the piece I wrote. Let me read my final paragraph. And I went, so which is it? Do we accept the politician's stated aim of trying to protect naive American youth from the moustache-twirling CCP, or instead view this bill as yet another power grab by the US security state? Most likely, it's a bit of both. And that's all I want to say.
Opium smoking CCP.
Well, moustache twirling is certainly not a racial or cultural thing. It's just a general, super villain.
Wouldn't go down very well.
Well, exactly. That's why moustache twirling's better. Or
cat petting.
Cat stroking, Bond villain type of thing. That's all I was trying to say. I think it's a bit of both, but my natural inclination is to be deeply suspicious of stuff like this. And I think basically what the US political and security establishment are trying to do is they found the one bit they can't control. Let's say hypothetically they can control Meta, they can control Google, they can control other social media platforms. What they can't control is TikTok because it's Chinese owned, so let's ban the fucker.
Yeah,
is what I think they're saying. Okay, let's leave it there. I'll just wrap it up, let you have your call. I'm going to get the bog. Thanks for listening. Make sure you join us for the next one.